Hello everybody, before the video starts I would like you all to subscribe and like the video. That's it, enjoy. Chapter 26. The other half of the brand. As the three continued their steady ascent up the mountain path, they once again entered another winding cave system, one that felt deeper and older than the ones before. The air inside was colder, and faint echoes bounced against the rocky walls. They did not walk far before encountering a new kind of threat that emerged from the shadows. Tatzelworms. Atreus shouted in alarm, his voice echoing throughout the cavern as the snake-like creatures slithered from the cracks in the walls. Zelos sighed, rubbing the back of his neck while glancing at Atreus. Why are you always yelling every time something new shows up? It's not like we're going to get caught off guard or anything. We can see them at the same time as you know. Atreus blinked in confusion, lowering his bow slightly. I honestly don't know. There's just this urge to shout, so I shout, he admitted, still sounding confused by his own instinct. Before Zelos could respond, Kratos' stern voice cut through their conversation. Enough. Focus. We have enemies at hand. He unsheathed his axe with a heavy sound, its faint blue light reflecting off the damp cave walls. Atreus smirked, wanting to get back at Zelos for teasing him. Let me guess. You're just going to use Zoltrak again. He said smugly, raising an eyebrow. Zelos looked at him with a half smile, raising one brow in return. As a matter of fact, no. I won't use Zoltrak or Hollow Purple this time. I'll show you something different, something with a little more range. He stepped forward, extending his arms outward. The air around him rippled as if the space itself was bending. Atreus watched as the ripples gathered and formed the shape of a sword made entirely out of shimmering light and condensed mana. Partisan, Zelos said clearly, and in an instant, multiple ripples appeared throughout the cavern. From each ripple emerged a massive greatsword, all suspended mid-air before launching toward the approaching Tatzelworms at incredible speed. The blades impaled and sliced through the creatures one by one until the cavern fell silent again. Here, Zelos said as he turned back and handed one of the conjured swords to Atreus. My gift for you. Atreus, assuming it would be light based on how effortlessly Zelos carried it, reached out casually. The moment Zelos released his hold, the sword dropped straight to the ground with a loud crash that cracked the stone floor beneath their feet. What in the? Atreus gasped, startled by the sudden weight. Kratos, who had already sheathed his axe, turned to look at the weapon with curiosity. The swords that had killed the Tatzelworms had already dissolved into particles of light, yet this one remained solid and unmoving. Kratos stepped forward and picked it up with one hand, feeling its balance. What kind of magic is this? He asked, his tone steady but curious. Zelos crossed his arms, watching him. It's a combination of metal conjuration and transmutation magic. I used a bit of my mana to stabilize its structure so it doesn't disappear. You can keep it if Atreus doesn't want it, he said casually. Kratos studied the sword more closely. Its design triggered a faint recognition in him. It resembled a weapon he had once wielded long ago. The shape, the length, even the balance reminded him of it, though the coloration was different. Unlike the one from his past, this sword did not carry the same pull of godly energy or the weakness that came with it. He swung it downward to test its weight, and when the blade struck the ground, it carved a deep rupture through the stone floor. The power and sharpness were undeniable. It's a fine weapon, Kratos said, turning his gaze to Atreus. You should try it. Atreus scratched his head awkwardly. I can't lift it. It's too heavy. Kratos looked at him with a knowing expression. It doesn't weigh anything. Zelos is only playing with you. Learn to recognize when someone is tricking you. It will help you avoid being fooled in the future. He tossed the sword lightly toward Atreus. On instinct, Atreus caught it, and to his surprise, the weapon felt weightless in his hands, exactly as Kratos said. Zelos grinned. Would you like me to make it smaller? He asked, already knowing the answer. Atreus frowned slightly but nodded. Fine. Just a little smaller. With a wave of his hand, Zelos adjusted the sword's size until it matched the proportions of the Ingrid sword that Atreus would one day wield. It fit neatly in his grasp, perfectly balanced. You'll grow into it, Zelos said simply. And like any weapon, it demands practice. As they continued through the cave, Atreus began to swing his new blade slowly, testing its weight and balance with every step. Zelos walked behind him, watching carefully to ensure the boy didn't accidentally injure himself. Kratos led the way ahead, remaining silent but observant as always. Eventually, they entered a wide chamber filled with strange wooden poles that emitted a thick green mist. The air was foul, heavy with poison. Atreus stopped swinging his sword, covering his nose and coughing from the smell. What is that? He asked, his voice muffled by his sleeve. Scorn pulls, Zelos said calmly as he raised his hand. Ice Age. In an instant, a wave of frost spread across the cavern, freezing the poisonous vapors and sealing the source beneath a thick layer of ice. Zelos controlled the output precisely, ensuring the spell only affected the corrupted section and nothing more. The air cleared, allowing them to pass through safely. One of these days, you're going to have to teach me some of your magic, Atreus said in admiration as he walked through the frost-covered tunnel, glancing at the frozen poles that glittered like blue crystals. I've already taught you the basics, Zelos replied, keeping his eyes forward. Practice those in combat first. When you've mastered them, we can discuss the advanced forms. Atreus smiled faintly. All right, I'll hold you to that. The three continued walking until the narrow tunnel opened once again to the outside. What greeted them was a field of heavy fog that hung thick in the air, so dense that they could barely see a few feet ahead. Zelos, Kratos said simply, the single word carrying his meaning. Zelos nodded and exhaled softly, summoning a small burst of wind imbued with primordial energy. The gust swept forward, dispersing the fog completely. As it cleared, the faint outline of a small figure appeared in front of them, someone bent over a workbench, hammering away at metal. Another dwarf, Atreus said aloud, his tone somewhere between surprise and curiosity. Kratos ignored the comment and continued walking toward the figure, followed closely by Zelos and Atreus. The dwarf looked up from his work as they approached, his eyes narrowing as they fell upon the weapon strapped to Kratos' back. Excuse me, the dwarf said suddenly, stepping forward. How did you come by that blade? Kratos stopped walking and looked down at him. That is my concern alone, he said firmly, his voice low. The dwarf frowned but did not back away. While I will not dispute that, I know that blade. It's one of ours. We forged it, but not for you. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his gaze remained fixed on Kratos. Kratos took a slow step forward, towering over him. Step aside, he said in a deep, commanding tone. I can't, the dwarf said, his voice faltering but his stance firm. The woman we crafted that weapon for, I am, quite fond of her. And I would be rather displeased if it turned out that you did something to her. He raised his fists awkwardly, trying to look ready for a fight, though it was obvious he had little combat experience. Zelos sighed, shaking his head slightly. That's enough, father. You already know who he is. That's Brock's brother. Kratos looked down again, recognizing the nervous but familiar face of the dwarf in front of him, Sindri. The tension eased slightly as Zelos' remark settled between them. Sindri, clearly frightened, looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of Kratos' glare. 42 comments 0 vote. Chapter 27, Magic Transfer. Zelos smiled at Sindri before taking a small step forward, deciding to introduce himself as well as his family. I'm Zelos. This is my younger brother, Atreus, and this is our father, Kratos, he began, gesturing toward each of them in turn. The axe in my father's hand belonged to our mother. Atreus and I gave it back to him before she passed away. Zelos' voice was calm and respectful as he explained the situation, making sure Sindri understood why they were there. Faye is dead, Sindri asked quietly, his expression changing from mild curiosity to visible shock. His usually quick and cheerful tone faltered. I'm very sorry to hear that. She was a fierce warrior, and a good woman. He looked down for a brief moment before straightening himself again. All right then, I'll make improvements to the axe. As Sindri began muttering to himself, deep in thought about the possible repairs, Zelos and Atreus exchanged a glance. Well, that makes sense, Zelos said in a slightly sarcastic tone. You knew our mother, therefore, you must improve her axe. Perfectly logical. Not confusing at all. Atreus snickered at his brother's comment, while Sindri glanced up, slightly offended but too polite to respond harshly. Well, knowing your mother, Sindri said as he rubbed his hands together, she would have insisted that I repair the damage caused by my brother's constant vandalism. She never did like his rough work. His voice carried both respect for Faye and mild irritation toward his brother. The blue one is your brother? Kratos asked, stepping closer to Sindri. His towering presence caused the dwarf to tense slightly, his eyes darting nervously upward. Yes, that would be Brock, Sindri replied quickly, his voice growing tight. But my skills are vastly superior, no boasting, I swear on Freya's name. Kratos continued to stare at him silently. Then, without a word, he pulled the axe from his back and extended it toward Sindri. Sindri flinched slightly, misunderstanding the gesture. Could you maybe set it down over there instead? The handle looks filthy. He forced a smile, trying to hide the discomfort in his voice. Kratos did not move. No. That single word froze Sindri in place. His mouth closed instantly. Zelos couldn't help but smirk a little as he witnessed one of Kratos's famously short answers in action. It's all right, Zelos said, stepping forward. He raised his right hand and channeled a faint magical glow. Here, let me. A gentle wave of green light passed over the axe, cleansing it instantly. The dried blood and grime disappeared as if wiped away by invisible hands. Even the faint scratches on the handle were smoothed out. It's thoroughly cleaned now, Zelos explained, lowering his hand. You don't have to worry about it. Even the smallest traces of dirt or microbes are gone. Sindri's jaw dropped slightly. You have got to teach me that magic, he said, looking at Zelos with wide, pleading eyes. Zelos smiled and walked closer until he was standing right in front of the dwarf. Consider it a fair trade, he said quietly. Then, without further explanation, he extended 2 fingers toward Sindri's forehead. Wait, what are you? Sindri began, but before he could finish the sentence, Zelos's fingertips touched his forehead. A bright flash appeared for a brief moment, and then Sindri froze in place. A surge of magical knowledge entered his mind all at once, overwhelming his senses. His knees wobbled, and he almost fell over, clutching his stomach as if he might throw up. There, Zelos said with a small grin. Consider that a payment for improving our axe. Sindri leaned against his workbench for a few moments, breathing heavily until the dizziness passed. Then, out of curiosity, he activated the spell he had just learned. A faint glow enveloped his body, and immediately he felt cleaner, lighter, as if every speck of dust and impurity had vanished. His eyes widened in amazement. You are a lifesaver, literally. Sindri exclaimed. Kratos and Atreus exchanged glances, thinking Sindri was merely acting like his usual grim-fearing self. But Zelos, who understood exactly what kind of relief the dwarf had just experienced, said nothing. He simply smiled, letting Sindri enjoy the moment. You're welcome, Zelos said quietly. Rejuvenated, Sindri confidently took the axe from Kratos, holding it carefully before setting it on his table. He then used the new cleansing spell once again, this time casting it across his entire workshop. The room shimmered faintly as every tool and surface became spotless, cleaner than it had ever been. After finishing his preparations, Sindri began upgrading the Leviathan axe, adjusting runes, reforging its edges, and muttering enchantments under his breath. While he worked, Atreus walked over to Zelos, his tone a little annoyed. Why couldn't you teach me magic like that? Atreus asked, crossing his arms. Zelos turned to him calmly. Because there's a difference between learning something through mastery and copying it. He explained. When you master a spell, it becomes part of who you are. It turns into second nature. You don't just know it, you understand it. Isn't that right, father? Kratos gave a simple nod in agreement. But, Zelos continued, if there's a spell you want to learn that doesn't involve combat magic, tell me. I'll give it to you myself. Atreus's expression softened. All right. That's fair enough. Their conversation ended just as Sindri finished his work. He turned, holding out the upgraded axe with both hands. All done, he said proudly. Kratos accepted it and immediately sensed the difference. The weapon felt sharper, sturdier, and somehow more balanced in his grip. What did you do? Kratos asked. Sindri began explaining each adjustment in detail, how he had reinforced the internal runes, corrected a few of Brock's mistakes, and improved the elemental channels that regulated the axe's frost power. When the explanation ended, Kratos gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Without another word, the 3 prepared to leave. Sindri waved as they walked away, calling out his thanks once more, especially to Zelos, who had given him the spell. The group continued their journey through the mountains, eventually reaching a steep section of rock that required climbing. Before Kratos could even begin, Zelos raised his hand, lifting them gently into the air with magic. I already know what spell I want you to give me, Atreus said excitedly once they reached the ledge. That flying one. Or floating. Whatever that was. Zelos smiled faintly and extended his hand again. Atreus, eager and impatient, waited with a grin, until the magic connected. A sudden rush of knowledge filled his mind, overwhelming him. Atreus's eyes widened before he dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Blue. You could have warned me first. he said between dry heaves. Zelos tilted his head in mild confusion. Didn't you see what happened to Sindri? I thought he almost puked because you touched him. You know, dwarf stuff. Atreus protested. You thought wrong, Zelos replied simply, watching as his younger brother slowly recovered. Once the nausea passed, Atreus stood and tried the new spell. His body lifted slightly off the ground for a moment before he lost balance and fell back down. See, Zelos said, smiling again. Mastery is better than copy. Atreus glared at him, irritated, and Zelos finally decided to stay quiet, at least for now. 3 comments 0 vote. Chapter 28. The Black Breath. As the three continued walking along the forest path, the atmosphere grew heavier, the once quiet woods now echoing faintly with the hiss of dark magic. Not long after, they encountered a poisonous revenant standing in the middle of the road. The creature's form was twisted and unstable, its body emitting faint green fumes as it fired concentrated blasts of poison and corruption. Every few seconds, the revenant would vanish from sight, reappearing in another spot through teleportation, attacking again before fading away. Zelos observed the creature for a moment, then decided to try something he had not used in years. He raised his hand and began forming intricate patterns in the air. Dimension Lock, he said quietly. It was a spell of his own creation, crafted long ago but never tested in real combat since he rarely met enemies capable of teleportation. As the spell activated, the air around them shimmered. The entire area glowed faintly with a pale blue light, and a complex set of runes briefly appeared across the ground and trees before vanishing just as quickly. For a second, everything became eerily still. The revenant tried to teleport again, but its form flickered violently and snapped back to place. Confused, it raised its staff to cast another poisonous blast, only for the attack to be blocked by a transparent barrier that Zelos had conjured moments earlier. Zelos extended his other hand and created a small fireball. This one moved deliberately slower than his usual casting speed, drifting lazily toward the revenant. The creature, expecting to dodge through teleportation, froze in confusion when its body refused to respond. Its glowing eyes darted around as if trying to understand what had happened, but it was already too late. The fireball struck it directly in the chest. The revenant caught fire instantly. Yet, instead of screaming or attempting to roll away, it continued standing in the same position, its arms twitching as if trying to perform some spell. The flames spread quickly, consuming the creature as Zelos increased the spell's power output to see how it reacted. Within moments, the revenant's body crumbled to ash, vanishing completely. Atreus, who had been watching the entire thing with wide eyes, tilted his head slightly. Why didn't it dodge? Is that creature stupid? He asked in a half-mocking tone, clearly amused that a monster capable of teleportation failed to move out of the way of a slow-moving attack. Zelos turned slightly to look at him. No, I think it became too dependent on teleportation, he explained calmly. Creatures like that rarely use their physical legs anymore. When I cast the Dimension Lock, it trapped the revenant within a fixed space, preventing it from teleporting. Since it didn't realize what had happened, it just waited for the right moment to move, and that moment never came. Atreus nodded slowly, processing the explanation. How do you even come up with these kinds of spells? He asked curiously. The more time he spent with Zelos, the more he realized how complex his magic truly was. It usually begins as an idea, Zelos said while continuing to walk forward. Every spell I create comes from the need to counter something else. For example, the Dimension Lock came after I designed a teleportation spell of my own. I asked myself, what if an enemy can teleport as well? And from there, I made a countermeasure. It's the same reason I have spells like Iceball to counter Fireball, or Cleanse to counter my mud spells. My goal is always to be prepared for every possible situation. Atreus seemed impressed, his curiosity growing with each answer. If you already have a teleportation spell, then why do you want to learn the dwarves' special technique? He asked. Zelos smiled faintly. Because the dwarves do not teleport. They walk between realms, he replied. There's a difference, and that difference is what I'm after. If I can understand the method they use to traverse realms by walking, then I might be able to modify that principle to let me travel between different dimensions as well. Atreus furrowed his brows. Why do you want that? To go to another world. Zelos nodded slightly, his tone calm but distant. Eventually, yes. There will come a time when there's nothing left to explore here. When that happens, I'll need to move on. It's the nature of growth, to keep moving forward when there's nothing left behind. You'll understand someday, Atreus. You'll have your own journey to take too. Atreus went quiet after hearing that, and for a moment, only the sound of their footsteps filled the air. Kratos, walking slightly ahead, said nothing, but his expression showed understanding. For him, moving forward was not a choice, it was something forced upon him by time and loss. As they continued to ascend the mountain, the group encountered more obstacles. Some were monsters, others were strange magical barriers or puzzles that blocked the way. Yet, none of them posed any real challenge. Zelos dispatched enemies with single spells, while puzzles that might have taken hours were solved in seconds by his analytical mind. Kratos and Atreus had grown used to this, walking calmly behind him without protest. Eventually, they reached an open plain covered with scattered stones and ancient ruins. At the center of the field stood a massive troll holding an enormous pillar. Unlike others they had fought before, this one looked directly at Kratos, as if recognizing him. The troll let out a low growl and prepared to strike. Before it could act, Zelos lifted his hand and summoned a chain of lightning. The energy arced through the air, striking the troll and the draugrs standing nearby. The intense surge vaporized all of them in an instant, leaving behind only faint smoke and scorch marks. Kratos and Atreus simply watched, their expressions neutral, having long accepted that Zelos' way of handling enemies was absolute and efficient. After climbing further up the mountain path, they finally reached a large cave entrance. Thick black smoke poured from within, spreading across the air like a living shadow. Atreus, driven by curiosity, reached out to touch it, but before his fingers could make contact, Zelos grabbed his wrist and pulled it back. Atreus, Zelos said sharply, his tone suddenly serious. What kind of brain do you have to think that's a safe thing to touch? Atreus blinked, caught off guard by the sudden reprimand. I was just curious. I wasn't going to, well, maybe I was. What is it anyway? He asked, pulling his hand away nervously. Kratos stepped closer, his voice deep and calm. What kind of magic is this? It was the first thing he had said since their encounter with Sindri. It's not a spell, Zelos replied after a moment of observation. It's a corruption of magic itself. A distorted form of energy that cannot be cleansed through simple purification. This kind of corruption spreads and feeds on nearby mana. It's far more dangerous than it looks. Before they could discuss further, the sound of wings echoed from above. A large bird descended rapidly, glowing faintly with green energy. As it landed, its form shifted and transformed into a woman, Freya. Kratos' eyes narrowed. Why didn't you warn us earlier? You knew our path, he said, his tone carrying his usual skepticism toward gods. Freya tilted her head slightly, her expression calm and sincere. Would you believe me if I said it slipped my mind? She said softly. The tone of her voice was genuine enough that even Zelos could tell she was telling the truth. Kratos remained silent for a moment before asking, do you know how to remove this corruption? Freya nodded slowly. Yes, but it is not simple. Only the light of Alfheim, the realm of the elves, can purify corruption of this nature. It is beyond the reach of ordinary spells. Zelos' eyes lit up with quiet excitement. Within his mind, he had been waiting for this moment since the day he was reborn. The light of Alfheim was something he longed to study. If he could obtain even a small essence of it and connect it to his own primordial energy, he could create entirely new kinds of magic. It was also a necessary step in reclaiming something deeply important to him, the missing soul piece of Brock. He said nothing, but a small, almost unnoticeable smile formed on his lips as the group prepared for what came next. 3-3 comments 0 vote. Chapter 29, Bridge to the Other Realms. As Freya finished explaining their dire situation, particularly regarding the black breath that would start to slowly killing Atreus, both Zelos and the ailing Atreus himself began to convince Kratos. They argued that they absolutely must travel to Alfheim, just as Freya had suggested, to retrieve its pure light. This light, she insisted, was the only thing powerful enough to disperse the encroaching darkness that threatened Atreus' life. Despite the gravity of this looming quest, the prospect of visiting another realm was something that the two younger travelers were surprisingly excited about. They had only ever known Midgard, and the idea of dimensional travel was a thrilling, new concept for them. Lead the way, Kratos commanded in his usual deep, resonant voice. His abrupt agreement was immediately followed by the enthusiastic cheers and celebration of Zelos and Atreus. Freya also allowed herself a small, warm smile as she looked at the way both Zelos and Atreus celebrated their minor victory. Their shared excitement strongly reminded her of her own brother, Freyr, and the time she spent with him long ago, before everything had changed. Since you have decided, Follow me, Freya then said, as she led them toward a specific part of the mountain. They arrived at a spot where they saw a large, wooden contraption built against the sheer cliffside. It's the Sky Mover, Atreus suddenly exclaimed, recognizing the device, which clearly made Freya look at Atreus with some confusion. The what? Freya then asked, as she was unfamiliar with the term. Atreus then began to eagerly explain what he and Sindri had talked about earlier during their brief encounter. Sindri, one of the dwarves we encountered, told me about this. He said that this thing would allow him to bring stuff, like his supplies and findings, from the mountain all the way down to its foot. It would allow him to ensure that everything is collected without dangerous physical labor, Atreus explained proudly. I did not see anyone earlier when I arrived, perhaps he had already finished his work. Dwarves are often remarkably resourceful, Freya then answered, scanning the area. This was added to by Kratos, who sounded weary. And irritating, based on the two we have met, Kratos said gruffly. He was already growing tired of the convoluted shenanigans of the Huldra brothers, despite only knowing them for a brief time. Yes, that too, Freya agreed, a small smirk appearing on her face, as she clearly agreed with Kratos' addition. So, where are we going once we are down the mountain? Atreus then asked, as they all boarded the wooden sky mover. Kratos took hold of the large lever. The moment Kratos moved the lever, the entire sky mover platform started to groan and slowly descend along the mountainside. See that bridge over there? Freya pointed out into the distance. The Temple of Tyr is right over the center of that bridge. That temple is special, as it also uses the Bifrost to connect with each of the realms. It is a very good thing that the temple is no longer submerged, Freya then said. This prompted a reaction from Atreus, who was not only amazed by the mechanics of the sky mover but also by the sheer beauty of the distant temple. Yes, the world serpent removed its body from the lake, which immediately dropped down the entire water level. It's amazing that there's a creature that could continuously grow without any apparent limits, Zelos then said, as he inserted himself into the conversation. He was standing near the edge of the platform, looking down at the river far below. Where did that creature come from? Kratos then asked. He remembered the massive eye of the world serpent staring at them, and his curiosity got the better of him, which made Kratos ask Freya for information. No one truly knows. He just appeared one day, suddenly present in the Lake of Nine. Soon after that, Thor attacked him, and their resulting battle could be felt across all the realms. Ultimately, it ended in a stalemate, and Thor returned to Odin empty-handed, having failed to kill the beast. The serpent stayed in the lake and grew so large he now spans all of Midgard, Freya then explained, as she answered the question that Kratos had in his mind. See, I told you, Atreus then said proudly to Kratos, puffing his chest slightly. His father did not believe him when Atreus said that the Midgard serpent spans the entire Midgard realm, which was something that Kratos clearly believed to be a childish exaggeration. They have hated each other ever since, they are destined to kill each other come Ragnarok, Freya then added solemnly. This additional detail immediately changed the expression of Atreus, as he knew what would happen in the events of Ragnarok. It was something that his mother, Faye, would often mention in her stories. You believe in Ragnarok? Atreus then asked Freya, his voice quiet. Freya just maintained a saddened expression on her face, in which she paused for a moment before answering him. I really wish I didn't, child, Freya said, answering Atreus, who also looked dejected. Freya also answered with a somewhat horrified voice, as if remembering a terrible vision. Ragnarok. That sounds fun, Zelos then suddenly said, breaking the heavy silence. His comment made Freya and Atreus look at him with a strange, shocked expression, while Kratos also looked back at Zelos with a little skepticism. Zelos, noticing all of their stares, suddenly looked back at them with a genuinely curious expression. Why? Is there something wrong? Zelos then asked innocently. Both Freya and Atreus, hearing his casual question, then boiled over, until Atreus finally asked, what's wrong with you? You just called Ragnarok fun. It's not something that anyone should be excited about. It's the end of everything, Atreus then went on his rant, as Atreus then began listing all the terrible things he knew about Ragnarok. Your younger brother is right, Freya then said, her voice firm. Ragnarok is not something to be excited about. Countless lives will end in this great, final battle. So, Zelos then answered, shrugging, as he defended himself. Lives end. That is the way of things. Mortal, immortal, even gods. Everyone dies eventually. You see, Ragnarok is something that will be the end of living, but Ragnarok is just one part of a much bigger cycle. It ends something old to give birth to something new. You keep looking at Ragnarok so closely, focusing only on the destruction, that you forget to look at it in the grand scale of things, which is what Ragnarok truly is. Both Atreus and Freya, who heard Zelos's words, began to think hard about his perspective. After a few more moments of quiet descent, they arrived at the base of the massive bridge. Freya led them inside the main temple structure, which was the same area they had already walked through just earlier. This time, however, was different. Before, the doors and gates were locked, as they would only work when there was a light of the Bifrost. Because the bridge was dark, they were not able to open them, and Zelos, for his part, did not try to pry them open. As they walked through the familiar hallway, Freya showed them the power of the light of Alfheim that she carried. She drew her bow and fired an arrow of pure energy, which caused the locked gates to burst open and summoned a bridge that was made entirely out of solid light. Atreus became amazed by the spectacle. Freya then led them along the side of the bridge, down closer to the water, where the massive, primary axle of the entire bridge mechanism was located. We must start with mending the axle back in place. Then, push it and realign it toward the tracks, Freya then instructed Kratos. The Spartan grunted, bracing himself, and was about to lift the entirety of the massive axle. But before he could even get a grip, Zelos then lifted it first. Zelos was not using his magic, but his raw physical strength. This was him showing off his incredible physical capabilities for the first time toward Freya, and also toward Atreus, who previously did not have any real idea on how strong Zelos truly was. Whoa, the entire bridge is tilting. How are you so strong? Atreus then asked, as he looked at Zelos, completely shocked. The massive stone and metal structure was visibly shifting from Zelos's effort alone. Freya, equally stunned by the display, looked at Kratos. Kratos, however, did not act surprised at all. He could still feel the memory of the punches that Zelos would throw when they used to do sparring. He knew it was something that would hurt him seriously if Kratos ever underestimated Zelos's true strength. Push it, Freya then instructed Zelos, recovering from her shock. Zelos then directly pushed the massive axle, which in turn, directly made the entire bridge mechanism move with a groan of ancient stone. This sight made Atreus even more surprised and shocked by the sheer strength that Zelos was showcasing. As Zelos pushed the axle back into its proper place, Zelos then looked up at Atreus smugly. Looks can be deceiving, little brother, Zelos said, his voice confident. Both he and Kratos started going back up the path toward where Freya and Atreus were waiting, while Atreus just stood there with his jaw dropped, utterly speechless. 40 comments 0 vote. Chapter 30. Alfheim. As the bridge was restored and steady once again, Freya led the three of them inside the temple. The air was cool and quiet, filled with faint glimmers of light reflecting from numerous crystals embedded in the walls. These crystals, as Zelos quickly noticed, could only be activated by the light of Alfheim. Their faint glow was like dormant embers, waiting for a spark to awaken them. While they walked through the winding corridor, Atreus, still filled with excitement for the journey ahead, began speaking again, unable to contain his curiosity. So, are these temples built by the giants for Tyr? Or were they made by the elves? Atreus asked, his eyes darting from one intricate carving to another. All the races helped with its construction, Freya replied, her voice calm yet tinged with nostalgia. It was the last great act of cooperation among the realms before peace disappeared for good. Her tone softened near the end, as if the memory itself carried a weight of sadness. For a brief moment, her gaze drifted elsewhere, perhaps toward a past life in her homeland, surrounded by her own people, before everything changed. Conflict isn't something new, Zelos interjected, his expression thoughtful. Even when peace is seen as the best path, it's not always the most possible one. Differences will always exist, and those differences make true peace difficult to maintain. Freya nodded slightly, impressed by his understanding. That's correct, child, she said gently. Despite sharing the same ancestor, every race, every people, feels the need to prove their superiority over others. It's something embedded deep within every being, in every realm. As she spoke, Freya raised her bow and fired a single arrow of shimmering energy toward one of the nearby crystals. The arrow struck true, and the crystal lit up brightly, releasing a radiant wave that formed a solid bridge made of pure light. The gate before them opened, revealing a passage further inward. However, as she loosed that shot, the glow of her bowstring dimmed noticeably. The faint energy that once ran through it flickered and faded. Freya sighed softly, glancing down at her weapon, then turned toward Atreus. The power of my bow is nearly depleted, she explained. Only a few knocks of magic remain, and we've just used the last of them. Your bow, please. She extended her hand gently toward him. Once you claim the light of Alfheim, you must infuse your bowstring with its power. Do not forget this. Atreus hesitated for a moment, then handed his bow over. You talk like you're not coming with us, he said, looking up at her questioningly. Freya smiled faintly, but there was sadness behind her eyes. I will try to accompany you, she answered. But there are those who have gone to great lengths to ensure that I remain here in Midgard. Who would do that? Atreus asked again, eager to know more. Before Freya could reply, Zelos spoke up, his voice calm but firm. Atreus, learn to read the atmosphere. It's clear this is not something she enjoys discussing. Atreus frowned, then lowered his head slightly, realizing his mistake. Freya gave him a reassuring smile. It's all right, she said softly. It's just that, the gods don't care much for me anymore. Her words trailed off, and for a few moments, none of them spoke. They continued walking until they entered a vast chamber. The room was dark, filled with the tangled roots of an enormous tree stretching across the floor and ceiling like veins. The air smelled of damp wood and ancient magic. Is this it? Atreus asked, looking around with mild disappointment. The stillness and lack of light made the place seem lifeless. Freya chuckled lightly at his reaction. This temple has been asleep, submerged beneath the water, for almost 150 winters, she explained. It needs only the light of the Bifrost to awaken again. She approached a pedestal at the center of the chamber and produced a small crystalline device. Handing it to Kratos, she said, this is a Bifrost key. It creates travel between realms. It can capture, hold, and transfer the light of Alfheim. Place the key there. She pointed to a circular slot carved into the stone table nearby. Kratos inspected the key for a moment, then fitted it carefully into the slot. As soon as he did, a pulse of blue light spread across the table. The glow deepened, swirling like water, and faint runes began to appear. The others watched in silence, waiting for something more to happen, but for several moments, nothing changed. What now? Kratos asked, his tone neutral but slightly impatient. Give it a moment, Freya replied. The temple has slept for a long time. It needs to remember itself. When it does, this place will awaken, and from this room, and this room alone, you will be able to cross between realms. Almost on cue, the light flared brighter, spreading upward and outward until the entire chamber began to illuminate. The roots glowed faintly, the walls shimmered, and the air itself seemed alive. Atreus's eyes widened in awe, while Zelos found himself quietly admiring the display of intricate design and power. Even Kratos seemed to pause, silently observing the beauty unfolding before them. What you see before you, Freya continued, represents the temple in which we now stand, and the realm towers that surround the Lake of Nine. All the realms exist within the same physical space, reflections of each other. These doors, the towers outside, and the 9 realms themselves are all bound together on the branches of the world tree, separated only by the light of the Bifrost. This place serves to focus and control that light. So this is the world tree? Atreus asked, puzzled. I thought it would be much larger. Freya smiled gently. This is only an artistic representation, she said. The true Yggdrasil is far greater than anything that can be built or seen here. Kratos then spoke, his tone simple and direct. How does it work? The tree of life is tied to the fate of the world, just as we are tied to it, Freya explained. Its roots nourish the soil. The dew from its leaves feeds every valley and river. The tree's existence supports all creation, its energy woven through every living thing. Birth, growth, death, and rebirth, all are part of its cycle. Everything returns to the tree in time. That is how it functions. She paused briefly, then smiled slightly. But I suppose you were asking for a more practical answer. Yes, Kratos replied flatly. Zelos quietly smirked, remembering the many jokes he once saw about Kratos's blunt responses in another lifetime. Very well, Freya said, turning to the massive mechanism before them. The bridge you pushed outside is currently aligned with Vanaheim. You must turn the wheel to redirect it toward our destination, Alfheim. Kratos immediately followed her instructions, gripping the large wheel and pushing it with steady force. The sound of heavy stone shifting echoed throughout the temple as the massive structure began to realign. While Kratos worked, Atreus continued asking questions, about the realm towers, about Tyr, and about the absence of a tower for the giants. Freya answered each patiently, her voice calm and steady, while Zelos listened quietly, absorbing every detail. Once the bridge was properly aligned, Freya gestured for Kratos to insert the Bifrost key again. He did so without hesitation. A sudden surge of light enveloped the entire room, blinding in intensity. Zelos felt the shift immediately, a distortion in space, like the world around them was bending and reforming. He could sense that their physical bodies remained still, yet their surroundings had begun to change. When the surge of light finally faded, the glow of the temple dimmed once again. The air felt different, lighter, thinner, carrying an unfamiliar scent. We're in Alfheim, Zelos thought, a grin slowly forming on his face. His eyes gleamed with excitement as he looked around, eager to explore this new realm. 34 comments 0 vote. Chapter 31, Sever. As soon as the process of traveling to another realm began, the entire chamber dimmed once more. The light that once filled the room faded slowly, as the structure returned to its previous sleeping state. The energy that had been sustaining the realm travel had now been spent, and the brilliant illumination of Alfheim faded into the faint glow of dying embers. Meanwhile, Atreus looked around in confusion. His eyes moved from wall to wall, searching for some kind of difference, but the surroundings appeared almost identical to before. There was no immediate change that he could notice, and it made him wonder if anything had happened at all. Didn't work. We're still here, Atreus said with uncertainty as he turned to Freya, who only chuckled softly at his impatience. Wait until we step outside, Freya replied calmly, her tone light but confident. Atreus's expression brightened a little, though he still seemed unsure. The Bifrost is dark, Kratos then said, his deep voice steady but firm, as he noticed the same dim glow that everyone else had already sensed. The energy source has been completely drained, Zelos explained, his voice thoughtful as he examined the faint shimmering residue on the ground. We'll need to collect another source of power to restore it, or we will not be able to return. Freya turned to him with a look of surprise. That is correct, she said, nodding slowly. The Bifrost must be replenished with the light of Alfheim. Without that, this trip will be our last one. But tell me, how did you know this? Zelos met her eyes and answered simply, I can feel the energy leaving the room. I am sensitive to these kinds of things. Freya studied him for a brief moment before nodding, understanding his words. She then led the group toward the large doorway that served as the exit. At her quiet request, Kratos stepped forward and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The moment the light spilled in, all of them were met by an unusual sight. Outside, the once radiant glow that was characteristic of Alfheim was now dim and faded. The light barely touched the ground, and the air itself seemed to have lost its vibrance. Freya's face shifted from calm confidence to visible concern. The light is almost gone, she said, her tone worried. Something is wrong. Look there, see that distant pillar with the faint glow. It is the temple's center, the place where the light is housed. She began to explain further, but in the middle of her sentence, a faint light suddenly flickered across her body. Her words caught in her throat, and her expression changed instantly to panic. No, no, not now, damn it, not yet. Freya shouted, her voice trembling as glowing threads of energy began pulling her backward. Kratos immediately reached out and grabbed her arm, holding on tightly as the invisible force tried to drag her away. What is happening? He demanded, his strength straining against the pull. Do something, Zelos. Atreus called, his voice filled with urgency. Zelos took a step forward and began chanting softly under his breath. His tone was calm yet deliberate, the rhythm carrying a power that resonated through the air. It was the first time he had used a complex spell that Faye herself had taught him, one he had further modified with his own magic. The technique was designed to temporarily sever the link between a person's true self and their physical form, creating a duplicate that would take on everything the original possessed, its magic, strength, and even its curses, leaving only memories and consciousness behind in the real body. As Kratos continued to pull Freya with all his might, a brilliant light began to shine beside them. Both he and Freya turned to look and saw Zelos standing still, his eyes glowing with the same ancient brilliance Atreus once displayed when he spoke in the language of the giants. The ground around him pulsed faintly as the air grew heavier, filled with his chanting voice. The light in front of him condensed, forming a shape resembling a sword made entirely of radiant energy. Zelos grasped it firmly and, without hesitation, swung the blade toward Freya's body. Sever, Zelos said clearly as the glowing edge passed through her. The sword did not harm her flesh, but it sent a burst of light through the room, followed by a sudden pulse that made the air ripple. A luminous form was torn away from Freya's body, splitting briefly into two before one half disappeared into the light that had been pulling her. The other half, the real Freya, collapsed onto the ground. Why did you do that? Atreus shouted immediately, stepping forward with alarm. He thought Zelos had just struck Freya down. Before Zelos could answer, Freya stirred. She slowly lifted her head, confusion etched across her face. She looked down at her hands, noticing that the glow and the sensation of being pulled away were both gone. What? How? She whispered, still in disbelief. Kratos and Atreus both looked relieved, realizing she was unharmed. Magical, isn't it? Zelos said casually, looking toward them with a faint smile. Freya stared at him, still trying to make sense of what had just occurred. I temporarily severed your true self from your physical form, Zelos explained calmly. Your body here remains, along with your consciousness, but the parts of you that were affected, your magic, your curse, the pull of whatever realm was trying to claim you, are now linked to the other body I created. For now, you exist in two realms at once. Complicated, I know, but it works. Kratos and Freya, both beings who had lived through countless centuries of magic and gods, found themselves completely silent. For once, they looked almost as bewildered as Atreus. Freya took a small step forward. Even as she struggled to understand what she had just experienced, tears began to form in her eyes. Then, without hesitation, she embraced Zelos tightly, thanking him repeatedly, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. Zelos stood stiffly, unsure how to respond. He turned to glance at Kratos and Atreus for help. Atreus, trying not to laugh, motioned with his hand for Zelos to hug her back, while Kratos remained quiet, watching the moment with his usual stern expression. Maybe we should continue with our mission, Zelos said after a moment, awkwardly patting Freya's shoulder. We wouldn't want to remain stuck here longer than necessary. Freya released him with a small, thankful nod, still clearly moved by what he had done. Zelos stepped back and walked toward Atreus, who was trying to hide a grin. Well, that was awkward, Zelos muttered quietly. Haven't you ever hugged Mother before? Atreus asked curiously. I wasn't talking about the hug, Zelos replied with a sigh. He was not used to people showing such open gratitude, and the unfamiliar feeling left him uncertain how to react. The four of them then began walking together toward the temple at the center of the faint light. Freya walked beside Kratos, while Atreus and Zelos followed close behind. The strange glow of the fading realm surrounded them as they continued onward, their mission still far from over. 53 comments 0 vote. Chapter 32, Light of Alfheim. The four of them then began their journey forward, carefully making their way through the narrow path that stretched ahead. Along the trail, large branches reached out across their way, twisting like arms of the forest itself, as if attempting to block their passage. Zelos raised his hand slightly and used a minor spell to gently push the branches aside, clearing the path without breaking or damaging them, something that made Kratos stop his instinctive motion to hack them away with his axe simply. Freya, noticing Zelos' approach, attempted to assist by channeling her own magic, but as she tried, she quickly realized that nothing was responding. Her connection to nature, the very essence of satyr magic, felt completely severed. She could no longer hear the faint whispers of the trees, nor feel the rhythm of the soil beneath her feet. For a moment, Freya's eyes widened with visible confusion, until she remembered what Zelos had told her earlier about the consequence of his spell. You weren't kidding, Freya said softly as she looked down at her hands, feeling the emptiness where her power once resided. My magic really is gone. Yeah, Zelos replied, glancing back at her as they stepped onto a wide platform. That's one of the main effects of separating your true self. It's not exactly pleasant, but sometimes, losing what you depend on most gives you a whole new way of seeing things. You might find the change useful later. Freya nodded silently, accepting his words. The group continued moving across the bridge-like structure, their footsteps echoing faintly. Soon, they came across an ancient wall covered with carved inscriptions written in the language of the elves. Only Kratos could not read it, while Zelos, Atreus, and Freya immediately recognized the script. Boy, Kratos said, motioning toward the runes. Atreus stepped forward and began reading the writing aloud. Something about an eternal war for the light. I don't get it. If both sides need the light, why don't they just share it? Zelos and Freya exchanged looks, while Kratos grunted quietly before replying. Greed, Kratos said simply. You will find it to be a common cause for war. Freya, however, shook her head lightly. It isn't just greed, she said, her tone thoughtful. The eternal war between the elves comes from a conflict in belief. The light elves want to control and shape the light, to bend it to their will. The dark elves, on the other hand, believe the light should remain untouched, untainted by mortal or divine hands. It is that difference in purpose that drives them to endless war. She paused for a moment, her voice quieter now. Sometimes, it takes nothing more than a difference in belief to justify the destruction of entire legions. Both Zelos and Kratos nodded at her words. Zelos understood all too well. He came from an age where, despite all claims of progress, people still managed to hate one another for things as trivial as the color of their skin. It was not even something magical, just the result of the places their ancestors had once lived. As they walked deeper into the bright yet strangely somber landscape of Alfheim, Atreus could not help but look around. Across all platforms, battles were occurring between the two races. He saw dark elves driving spears through light elves, who fell lifelessly from the sky. The violence was brutal and unrelenting, and it unsettled him deeply. They keep murdering the light elves, Atreus said quietly, his eyes filled with disbelief as he witnessed another group fall. What you are seeing, Kratos said, his tone calm but heavy, is the result of war. The dark elves have won. Freya nodded slightly, her eyes distant as she watched the battlefield below. As a former leader who had commanded armies herself, she understood the sight all too well. Should we do something? Atreus asked, turning to his father. His voice carried genuine concern. Kratos opened his mouth to respond, but Zelos spoke first. Do not judge a battle solely by what your eyes show you, Zelos said. What may seem unjust to us could be the inevitable result of years of struggle. Wars like these stretch across centuries. Each side has done terrible things to the other, and now, all that's left is survival. What you see as cruelty is, to them, self-preservation. Atreus blinked, confused. I don't understand what that means. It means don't interfere in something that isn't your business, Zelos clarified. Conceal. With that single word, he extended his hand, and a wave of energy enveloped the four of them. The air shimmered slightly before vanishing entirely, leaving no trace of their presence behind. Neither sound nor scent nor shadow could be detected. Even the dark elves flying nearby passed them by without hesitation, completely unaware that anyone else was there. Freya raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. Your concealment magic is remarkable, she said, her voice filled with curiosity. It hides not only our physical forms but our very presence. Even those attuned to energy would not be able to sense us. Zelos turned to her with mild surprise. How were you able to tell, even without your magic? Freya smiled faintly. Experience. I may not be able to command nature right now, but I've lived long enough to understand the subtle signs of great magic. The way the air bends around us, the stillness it leaves behind, it's unmistakable. I could learn a lot from your brain, Zelos said absent-mindedly. Freya blinked in confusion, while both Kratos and Atreus stared at him in silence. It took Zelos a moment to realize how his words had sounded. I mean, he corrected quickly, to study under your guidance, not literally study your brain. Freya laughed softly, easing the tension. When you have time, I would gladly exchange knowledge with you. Especially if it means sharing spells and theories of magic. Mark the date, Zelos said enthusiastically, smiling as the group continued forward. The concealment held strong, keeping them hidden as they crossed another wide bridge. The dark elves flew above, scanning for enemies, but none of them noticed the four travelers quietly walking below. After a while, they reached a small forge built into the stone, a familiar structure that Kratos, Atreus, and Zelos immediately recognized. It was Sindri's workshop. Wait, is that Sindri? Atreus asked in surprise. Wow, that teleportation magic you wanted to learn from the dwarves really is incredible. I didn't even see him use the Bifrost. Told you it was worth the effort, Zelos said with satisfaction. Freya looked slightly confused and turned to Kratos, as if asking for an explanation, but Kratos remained silent. Zelos then extended his hand and whispered a small incantation, granting Sindri the ability to see them through the concealment. Aghhh. Sindri yelled out in panic as the four suddenly appeared before him, causing him to stumble backward. Zelos immediately cast a noise suppression spell so their presence would not draw unwanted attention. You nearly scared the life out of me. Sindri complained, clutching his chest. When he looked up, his eyes went wide as he recognized Kratos standing just a few feet away. Then, his gaze shifted toward Freya, and he froze entirely. Why, your majesty, Freya? Sindri stammered, lowering his head and nearly kneeling before her. Freya quickly placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, stopping him from bowing fully. Atreus blinked, looking between them in confusion. Wait, you're Freya. The goddess Freya. Freya chuckled softly at his reaction, smiling in a way that lightened the tension. Her identity was now revealed to the one person in their group who had remained unaware until now. 39 comments 0 vote. Chapter 33. Voices. Atreus began to bombard Freya with countless questions, his curiosity overflowing as usual. Freya, showing remarkable patience, answered each of them with calm explanations and a gentle tone. While this was happening, Kratos handed his Leviathan axe to Sindri, who immediately began to examine it with his usual mix of pride and complaint. Sindri muttered under his breath about his brother's crude craftsmanship and lack of artistic refinement when it came to forging weapons, all while continuing to work on improving the axe's balance and power. Kratos, as expected, stood silently, ignoring Sindri's comments without even a glance. Meanwhile, Zelos's attention drifted toward the water nearby. His eyes scanned the surface until he noticed something that caught his focus. There was only one boat available, and it was clearly small enough to fit only 2 people. He stood quietly for a moment, then raised his hand and whispered a single word. "Duplicate," he said softly. Instantly, the air shimmered above the water as a second boat appeared beside the first, identical in shape, weight, and structure. It was a perfect copy, created through magic precise enough to replicate even the smallest carvings on the wood. Zelos preferred it that way. He did not wish to fly this time, wanting instead to enjoy the calmness of the water and the open sky, much like he did back in Midgard. When he was done, Kratos, Freya, and Atreus walked over, their eyes landing on the 2 boats now floating side by side. "So," Zelos asked, turning toward the others, "who's going with whom?" The 3 took a moment to consider the situation. Freya was still powerless, her magic severed and unreliable. Atreus was young and inexperienced when it came to traveling across other realms. The choice, therefore, was rather clear. "Zelos," Kratos said firmly, "take the other boat and go with Freya. I'll take this one with Atreus." Zelos nodded in agreement, but before they could depart, Atreus suddenly looked around with confusion written across his face. "What's that?" Atreus asked, his voice uncertain, as if he had just heard someone speaking. Freya looked puzzled, Kratos frowned slightly, but Zelos's expression changed almost immediately. He knew exactly what it was. He had experienced the same thing before, the faint echoes that reached the minds of those with giant blood. These were the whispers of the souls connected to the light of Alfheim, voices filled with pain and pride, crying out about how the light was their birthright. No one said anything, boy, Kratos said sharply. "Huh. All right," Atreus muttered, rubbing his ear as if trying to shake off the sound. Zelos knew that the voices were never clear at first. They always started as faint murmurs before becoming unbearable. Freya quietly stepped into the boat that Zelos had created. With a wave of his hand, the boat lifted slightly, then floated down beside the one Kratos was already pushing into the water. Once they were both ready, the 2 boats began to drift forward, cutting through the gentle current of Alfheim's shimmering waters. Zelos took the oar and began rowing slowly, keeping a steady rhythm. Freya sat across from him, her eyes glancing toward the open expanse of light that reflected beautifully across the water. For the first time in a long while, she seemed at peace. Her expression softened, and she smiled, something warm and unrestrained. "You have a beautiful smile," Zelos said without much thought, his tone casual and sincere. "You should do that more often." Freya blinked in surprise, not expecting such a comment from him. Then a small laugh escaped her lips. "You have quite a smooth tongue for someone your age," she replied lightly. "You'll make some woman very happy one day." Zelos smiled at her response and shook his head slightly. "I'd like to have the kind of love my father had for my mother," he said thoughtfully. "He doesn't show it much, but the closer we get to fulfilling her last wish, the heavier his heart grows. Father may seem cold, even emotionless, but once you understand his ways, you realize how deeply he cares. He just doesn't know how to show it." As he spoke, his eyes drifted toward the other boat where Kratos and Atreus were already several meters ahead, moving faster. Zelos intentionally kept their pace slower, choosing instead to savor the moment, watching the gentle movement of the waves. The concealment spell he had cast ensured that no hostile creature would notice them. Freya's gaze lowered slightly. "I wish I had found that kind of love," she said quietly. "But all I had was lies and twisted affection that turned into misery." Zelos looked at her for a brief moment and replied calmly. "Do not doubt what fate has planned for you. Perhaps the kind of love you're meant to find is still ahead. Maybe sooner than you think." He said it casually, but the tone lingered in a way that made Freya fall silent. There was something in his voice that hinted at more than simple comfort, though Zelos himself did not notice. The two continued to row, the silence between them growing heavy yet not uncomfortable. The sound of the oars slicing through the water filled the air, broken occasionally by Atreus's voice echoing faintly across the lake. The boy was muttering again, reacting to something unseen. Kratos's deep voice answered him each time, firm and steady, insisting that nothing was speaking to him. Then, without warning, Atreus cried out in pain. He grabbed both sides of his head, pressing his hands tightly against his ears as if trying to block out unbearable noise. Atreus! Kratos called immediately, pulling his boat closer. Zelos reacted at once, lifting his oar and guiding his boat near them, with Freya standing to keep balance. What happened, father? Zelos asked as Kratos held his son. Atreus winced, his voice trembling as he spoke. Voices. Can't you hear them? So many angry voices all around us. Freya looked around but sensed nothing. Zelos shook his head slightly. No, he said calmly, though he already knew the truth behind it. He refused to reveal what Atreus was hearing just yet. Kratos looked toward the others, and they both confirmed the same. We do not, Kratos said firmly. Atreus's breathing slowed gradually, the pain easing as the noise faded away. When all was quiet again, the group continued forward. The calm returned, though the boy's confusion lingered in his eyes. Eventually, their boats reached another wide platform made of pale stone, glowing faintly with runic symbols. In the center was a sand bowl, much like the one they had found earlier in their journey. What does it ask? Kratos said, his tone steady. Atreus stepped forward, reading the inscription etched into the stone. Without me or within me, death is sure. Yet within you, I am life most pure. He looked around, puzzled. But I don't see any runes here. Kratos crossed his arms, studying the area carefully. After a moment of silent thought, he came to a decision. There are two paths here, Kratos said. We will split up and search both sides. We meet back here once we find something. Zelos nodded, understanding immediately. He and Freya returned to their boat, while Kratos and Atreus stepped into theirs once again. The calm water rippled beneath them as they pushed off, separating in opposite directions across the radiant lake of Alfheim. Chapter 34. Deepening Relations. When both Freya and Zelos boarded the boat once again, they began rowing toward the opposite shore, aiming to cross to the other side of the lake. The light of Alfheim reflected softly across the surface, and the air felt still and quiet, almost serene. Zelos took the oars, his movements steady and measured. For a while, neither of them spoke, until Zelos suddenly thought of something that made him glance toward Freya. You used to be a Valkyrie, right? The queen of them, if I remember correctly, Zelos asked curiously. Freya looked at him, slightly raising her eyebrows. She was uncertain where the question was leading. Yes, that is true, she replied calmly. Why do you ask? For self-protection, Zelos answered briefly, his tone casual yet thoughtful. He raised his hand and spoke softly, partisan. A faint glow surrounded his palm as a weapon began to form in the air. The light slowly shaped itself into a sword that resembled the one Freya had once wielded during the events that would come to be known as Ragnarok. When the summoning was complete, Zelos began to enchant it, carefully weaving strength and precision into the blade. He focused on making it durable enough to withstand the strain of combat and sharp enough to cut through anything that might threaten them. When he was satisfied with the result, he offered the weapon to Freya. She accepted it without question, running her fingers gently along the hilt, feeling the power contained within. I thought you would be the one protecting me, Freya said teasingly, her lips curling into a small smile. The tone in her voice was playful, and even though Zelos had little experience when it came to such things, he caught it immediately. What is going on right now? Zelos thought to himself, though his face showed no reaction. Despite his composed exterior, his heartbeat had suddenly quickened. He forced himself to remain calm and answered as naturally as he could. It would be a waste not to witness the skills of the legendary leader of the Vanir and the renowned goddess Freya herself, Zelos said, finding his words carefully. I figured you might miss the feeling of battle more than anything. He paused for a moment, then added, besides, a woman who can wield a sword with grace and precision deserves admiration. It's practically a rule. The way he said it came out awkwardly sincere, which made Freya laugh. The sound echoed softly across the lake. Despite the vast difference in their ages, there was no tension or distance between them. The more they spoke, the more they found an easy rhythm, two people who, for different reasons, understood the weight of solitude. By the time they reached the shore, the two had grown comfortable in each other's company. You really do have a silver tongue, Freya said with amusement, glancing sideways at him. I try my best, Zelos replied with a small grin. Should I remove the concealment spell? It might make things more interesting for you if enemies decide to show up. Freya nodded in agreement. Zelos lifted the concealment from the two of them, letting their presence be felt again. Then he conjured another sword for himself, adjusting its weight and size until it felt natural in his grip. With their weapons ready, the two began to explore the shoreline, searching for clues that could lead them to the mechanism connected to the sand bowl they had seen earlier. Zelos already had a rough idea of where it was, but he found himself intentionally delaying. He wanted to spend a little more time here, beside Freya, walking without urgency. He also chose not to use any of his stronger magic. The concealment over Kratos and Atreus was still active, and he had made sure it would hold without needing his constant focus. That gave him room to simply enjoy the moment. Not long into their exploration, they encountered several Draugrs wandering the area. Without a word, both Zelos and Freya exchanged a glance, and the same faint smile appeared on their faces. It was the kind of expression that warriors shared before battle. Then they charged. Freya leapt gracefully into the air, swinging her sword in a clean, fluid motion that sliced a Draugr neatly in half. She landed softly, looking briefly at the blade with satisfaction. Nice sword, Freya remarked, a hint of pride in her tone. Zelos smiled, saying nothing, as he turned and struck another Draugr that came toward him. Their movements were smooth and practiced, a mix of natural instinct and refined technique. Together, they cut through the enemies without allowing a single one to strike them. At one point, a Draugr lunged at Freya from behind. Zelos reacted instantly, blocking the blow. Freya used the opening to slash at the creature he was holding off, cutting it down. Zelos kicked another Draugr nearby, sending it tumbling backward before finishing it off. When the last enemy fell, both of them paused, their breathing steady. Satisfied smiles crossed their faces. Freya felt a surge of freedom in that moment, fighting again, moving without restriction. Zelos, on the other hand, found himself strangely drawn to her. It wasn't just admiration, there was something deeper he couldn't quite define. The thought itself made him uneasy, considering how old Freya truly was, and the fact that her son was far older than he would ever be. They continued their search, talking as they walked along the narrow paths and checking every corner of the area. The more they explored, the clearer it became that there was not much left to investigate. Zelos knew that their time together on this small side of the lake was nearly over, and though he said nothing, a quiet disappointment settled inside him. Eventually, they reached a cave system that led further upward. Inside, they found a platform mechanism that could lift them to higher ground. They stepped onto it, and as it rose, more creatures appeared, nightmares and tatzelworms, crawling from the walls and shadows. Freya and Zelos immediately fell into sync once again. Freya's strikes were swift and elegant, while Zelos handled the faster enemies with controlled precision. Their cooperation was effortless, each one covering the other's blind spots as if they had trained together for years. The path led them to an open chamber at the top of the cave. There, standing before them, was a large wheel attached to ancient gears. From where they stood, they could see the circular platform below and the metal structure protruding from the lake, still half-buried. Zelos approached the wheel and began to turn it slowly. The metal piece below started to rise, revealing the shape of a large curved structure resembling half of a horseshoe. He continued to rotate the mechanism until it locked in place with a heavy sound of metal clicking. Once the task was complete, both he and Freya began making their way back toward the boat. Their steps were quieter this time, and though neither spoke, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Something about their small adventure had changed the space between them. As they walked through the cave, Zelos finally decided to break the silence. I really enjoyed our time together, he said honestly. Maybe when all of this is over, we could do it again. I'd like to see you one more time. Freya looked at him, a little surprised at first, but then smiled gently. I would like that too, she said, her tone warm and soft. They shared a quiet smile before stepping back into their boat. The water rippled as they began to row toward the center platform once again. During the trip, the faint sound of moving metal echoed across the lake, the same mechanical sound that had followed when Zelos had activated the wheel earlier. The rest of the ride was silent but comfortable. Occasionally, they glanced at each other, exchanging small smiles that carried meaning they did not speak aloud. When they finally reached the main platform with the sand bowl, they disembarked. A short time passed before Kratos and Atreus appeared from the opposite side. What happened? Atreus asked curiously, noticing that something felt slightly different about the air around them. Nothing happened, Zelos replied simply, his tone calm and unreadable. Atreus accepted the answer without question. All right, he said, nodding. Kratos, however, let his gaze linger on the two of them for a few seconds longer. He noticed something in the way they stood, in the subtle change in Freya's demeanor, and even in the faint expression on Zelos's face. But he said nothing. Whatever he saw, he chose not to address it. 82 comments 0 vote. Chapter 36. The Dead. As both Atreus and Kratos turned their attention toward the massive structure that they had just restored, Atreus's eyes widened in excitement. Those pillars and the rings form an elvish rune, Atreus said eagerly as he leaned closer to inspect the design. It reads, water. He paused for a moment, thinking carefully about the connection, while Kratos, Freya, and Zelos looked at him with patient expectation. After a few seconds, realization dawned on his face. Wait, father, let me try this, Atreus said, holding up his hand as he turned toward the sand bowl. Without me or within me, death is sure. Yet within you, I am life most pure. He nodded with certainty. Yes, it's water all right. Kratos said nothing, simply observing his son's focus. Atreus crouched near the bowl and began tracing the rune of water onto the sand, his movements deliberate and careful. Took you long enough, Zelos muttered, which immediately earned him an annoyed glare from Atreus. Freya, standing nearby, smirked lightly at the exchange but didn't comment. When Atreus finished tracing the rune, the entire platform began to tremble beneath their feet. The vibration spread outward, and moments later, the surface of the river started to split apart, revealing a massive structure hidden beneath the water. Zelos, sensing the disturbance, quietly recast the spell of concealment over himself and Freya. Freya noticed the faint shimmer of magic forming around her but chose not to react, simply glancing at Zelos with a brief knowing look. As the river continued to separate, Zelos suddenly heard a familiar voice echoing faintly in his mind. It was soft, warm, and unmistakable. Son, the voice said gently. Zelos froze for a moment. His eyes widened, and his gaze immediately turned toward the brilliant light ahead of them. He knew that voice. It belonged to his mother, Faye herself. Mother. Zelos called out quietly, but there was no response. Before he could say anything else, Atreus suddenly collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Ag! Atreus cried out in pain, his voice echoing in the hollow space around them. Kratos immediately moved to his side, his expression hardening with concern. Zelos and Freya quickly joined them, both trying to help Atreus steady himself. It's those voices again, Atreus said between heavy breaths. But this time, they're not angry. They're asking for help. Kratos's face remained firm, his tone steady but cold. We are here for the light. I do not care who they are or what they want. Atreus frowned, the frustration in his voice barely restrained. You never care about anything, he muttered under his breath, though it was loud enough for everyone to hear. Kratos turned to him sharply. Do you have something to say? He asked, his tone commanding. Atreus quickly shook his head. No, he said softly. Freya and Zelos exchanged brief glances but said nothing. The tension between father and son was palpable, though it was something both of them had seen before. As the splitting of the lake finally settled, the group noticed movement in the air above. A dark figure emerged, wings flaring and eyes glowing faintly. It was a dark elf, but something about him was different from the ones they had fought earlier. His horns were longer, curved, and his armor more refined. He's different, Zelos remarked quietly. Do you know why? Freya turned her eyes toward the creature and nodded slightly as recognition crossed her face. That is Svartaljofer, the king of the Dark Elves. It seems he is commanding his army to continue the fight against the Light Elves, she said. Her tone grew heavier as she continued. We must not interfere with their war. It is of utmost importance that we stay out of it. Why? Atreus asked, clearly displeased. They are massacring the Light Elves. Shouldn't we help them? Kratos's jaw tightened, though he remained silent, allowing Freya to answer. Because wars such as these are meant to be resolved by those who started them, Freya explained patiently. When two sides choose conflict, they must face the outcome on their own. Interference from outsiders disrupts the balance. The losses, the victories, and the scars that come after, all of these are the consequences they must bear. Her words silenced Atreus, though his expression showed that he didn't completely agree. Kratos seemed satisfied by the explanation, and the group began to move forward once again. Freya and Zelos walked a little behind, following the others at a slower pace. After a few moments of quiet walking, Freya spoke softly. Did they always have these kinds of disagreements, your father and your brother? She asked curiously. Zelos nodded slightly before answering. Yes, they do. Father values discipline above all else. He believes that as the head of our household, his word should be followed without question. Atreus, however, doesn't always share that same view. He paused for a moment, thinking about the two of them before continuing. Father isn't the type to show affection openly. Because of that, Atreus grew closer to our mother. Now that she's gone, he expects the same warmth and comfort from father, but that's something difficult for him to give. They are both grieving, just in different ways. And I suppose, in a way, we all are. This journey is our way of fulfilling the last wish our mother left for us. So both of them are still dealing with grief, Freya summarized softly. Yes, Zelos replied simply. Freya glanced at him with quiet concern. And how do you deal with yours? She asked. Zelos was taken slightly off guard by the question. He slowed his steps and looked forward, deep in thought. Despite his otherworldly origin, he still viewed Faye as his true mother, the first person who had given him love and belonging in either of his lives. Believe it or not, Zelos began, I accepted it a long time ago. I knew of her sickness when I was 5 winters old. From that day, I tried everything, every kind of magic, every healing spell I could study, to find a cure. Most of the healing magic I use now was originally created for her illness. He paused briefly, his expression unreadable. But mother always refused treatment. She told me that death is a part of life, and that I should learn to accept it. I've been grieving since the moment I understood the truth, but I've also learned to hold on to her words. They are something I choose to remember, something that guides me even now. Freya's expression softened as she listened. That must have been difficult, especially for someone so young, she said sincerely. Zelos gave a small nod. It was, he admitted. But even now, I'm not entirely done searching. I still believe there might be a way to bring her back. I just haven't found it yet. Freya stopped walking, looking at him with disbelief. The living should not interfere with the dead, she said firmly. It is not only unnatural but also wrong. The dead deserve their peace. Zelos turned his head slightly, his eyes calm but serious. If you were in my place, and you had the power to bring your loved ones back, wouldn't you at least try? It's easy to say that some things should not be done, but when faced with the same loss, very few can truly stand by that belief. Freya said nothing. She remained still, watching as Zelos continued walking forward. His words lingered in her mind, quiet but heavy. For someone so young, his view of life and death was unsettlingly mature, shaped not by idealism but by experience, and perhaps, by something far older than his current self. Chapter 37. Light of Alfheim. The journey continued smoothly as the group moved deeper into Alfheim. For a long while, they did not encounter any enemies, and the only obstacles that stood in their way were the intricate puzzles scattered along their path. Each puzzle, though cleverly designed, was solved with relative ease through their combined intellect and cooperation. However, the further they traveled toward the center of the platform, and the closer they got to the light itself, the more violence they began to witness. Across the luminous bridges and floating ruins, they could see the light elves being mercilessly slaughtered by the dark elves. The sight unsettled Atreus greatly, his eyes constantly drifting toward the ongoing carnage. Kratos, aware of his son's stares, chose not to respond. He remained focused on their path, pretending not to notice, though the tension between them was almost visible. Freya, who walked at the rear beside Zelos, stayed silent as well. She understood the urge Atreus felt to intervene, yet she also knew that it was not her place to interfere in how Kratos chose to guide his son. After witnessing yet another brutal execution, where a light elf was forced to his knees and beheaded by 2 dark elves without offering even a hint of resistance, Atreus finally snapped. He wasn't even fighting back. Atreus shouted, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. They just killed him, and you're standing there doing nothing. You never care about anything. His words were directed at Kratos, but his accusing eyes turned briefly toward Zelos as well. Zelos, however, did not respond with anger. His stare at Atreus was calm, though it carried a weight of disappointment. You could be easily manipulated, Zelos said, his tone low and controlled. That kind of naive righteousness might feel noble, but one day it will cost you something important. Imagine, for example, that you knew nothing of the Aesir's crimes, nothing of the pain they caused, but you saw them being slaughtered during Ragnarok. If you acted only on what your eyes saw, you might decide to help them. That's the same kind of thinking you are doing now. You do not know the full truth behind what you see, yet you are already judging who holds the moral high ground. The world does not bend to what looks right, Atreus. Things are rarely as simple as you believe. Atreus froze, unable to find a response. The sting of Zelos's words sank deep, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. I didn't know, Atreus managed to say quietly. That's right, Zelos continued. You didn't know. But you act as though you understand everything. I don't pretend to know all things either, yet I've seen enough to understand when to trust Father's judgment. His experience runs deeper than both of us combined. You, on the other hand, have barely left our home, yet you already think you know the world. Zelos's tone softened near the end, but the message was clear. Atreus lowered his gaze, saying nothing further. Kratos, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally turned toward Zelos. That is enough, Zelos, he said firmly. Apologize to your brother. He is still a child. Zelos looked at Kratos for a moment, then nodded slowly. If my words were harsh, I will apologize, he said calmly. But what I said still stands. He needs to learn that not everything is what it appears to be. Kratos said nothing more, and the group continued their ascent in silence. Freya, walking beside Zelos, glanced at him with curiosity. The usual lightheartedness in his expression was gone, replaced with an uncharacteristic seriousness. His steps were steady, his focus sharp, but his mood was clearly heavier than before. I never thought you would snap that easily, Freya said softly, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. You seem to be angry about something. Care to share it? Zelos took a breath before answering. It's not something that can be shared easily. It's something that must unfold naturally, in its own time, he said, his tone distant. Freya frowned, slightly confused. What does that mean? It means that some truths must be left to reveal themselves. If forced, they lose their purpose, Zelos replied simply. In truth, the reason for Zelos's outburst was something he could not explain. He already knew that his mother's soul was within the light of Alfheim. If they interfered with the light elves or altered the balance in any way, they might unknowingly destroy her essence before he could fulfill his plan. To him, helping the light elves meant helping in his mother's disintegration, something he could never allow. Yet he also knew that he could not tell Kratos or Atreus, not until the right time. Ignorance is bliss, Zelos thought as he glanced toward Atreus, who was still quietly walking ahead, lost in his own thoughts. Zelos's eyes then drifted toward Kratos. Though the Spartan walked with his usual composure, Zelos could sense the weight pressing down on him. It was not the fatigue of battle but the exhaustion of carrying grief and duty at the same time. His father's strength lay not only in his might but in his endurance, his willingness to bear pain in silence to fulfill Faye's final wish. After several puzzles and turns through the ancient corridors, the group finally reached the heart of Alfheim. The light stood before them, now freed from the thick roots that had once covered it. Its radiance filled the chamber with a pale brilliance, though to Zelos, it felt distant, hollow even. He knew the truth, the light elves could not wield its power without risking their own destruction. Step into the light, Freya said quietly to Kratos. But be careful not to be swallowed by it. Remember what I told you. Kratos gave a single nod and pulled out the device Freya had given him earlier, the Bifrost key capable of storing the light's essence. As Kratos prepared himself, Zelos suddenly felt a pulse run through his arm. Dark markings appeared along his skin, glowing faintly like veins of shadow. He closed his eyes, focusing his energy. The abyss mark began to stir as he sensed the faint signature of what he was searching for, the missing fragment of Brock's soul. The moment Kratos entered the light, Zelos began his own work. He muttered an incantation under his breath, the sound low and rhythmic. Atreus, who had been watching from nearby, finally broke the silence. What are you doing? He asked cautiously, perhaps seeking to ease the tension that still lingered between them. I'm finishing my task for Brock, Zelos replied, his focus unbroken. Freya, curious but unaware of the full story, tilted her head slightly. What task? What happened with the Huldra brothers? Without pausing his spell, Zelos began to explain everything that had occurred, the deal he made with Brock, the accident that split the dwarf's soul, and the promise he had made to help restore it. Freya listened carefully, her expression softening as she understood. The dwarves truly are a resourceful people, Freya said thoughtfully. But shouldn't you be heading to the Lake of Souls for that kind of work? As its name suggests, it's where the souls of gods and creatures alike tend to drift. Zelos shook his head slightly, his hands glowing with faint energy. Here will do. The realms are connected in more ways than most believe. I have my own method to locate and call forth what I need. He then began chanting once again, his voice calm and deliberate. His eyes reflected a faint blue hue, the sign of deep magic at work. Every spell Zelos had mastered concerning the soul traced back to Faye's teachings, though she had never explicitly said that it was giant magic. Still, he could feel the difference, the depth, the complexity, it was unlike anything else. Domi Reversi, Zelos spoke clearly, releasing the final phrase. The markings along his arm flared for a moment, then faded. The air shimmered softly as a faint ripple of light spread outward. It was a calling, a bridge for a lost soul to find its way back, purified and restored. The spell was meant to return Brock's essence to its natural form, ensuring it would not remain trapped as a fragment of the light itself. 38 comments 0 vote. Chapter 38. Mission accomplished. As the effects of the Domi Reversi began to take hold, the markings on Zelos's arm started to glow. The abyss mark he bore was unlike the usual kind, its color carried a distinct reddish hue mixed with faint streaks of black, giving it a strange, volatile appearance. Then, the mark lit up with electricity. The lightning that emerged was unlike normal lightning that travels in a single path. Instead, it scattered, branched, and circled around itself, moving with a rhythm that almost looked alive. The lightning shaped itself into a whip of energy, which began to spin rapidly around the light of Alfheim. With each passing second, it moved faster and faster until it no longer appeared like a whip but rather a perfect ring of blinding energy surrounding the light. Then, with a sharp pull, the lightning whip shot inward and pierced through the light. Zelos placed his hand upon the glowing magic circle he had drawn for the Domi Reversi, gripping it firmly. The abyssal mark on his arm pulsed, connecting itself to the magic circle through his contract with Brock. The two energies merged, forming a tether meant to attract the missing fragment of Brock's soul, which had become one with the light. Minutes passed, the cave filled with the constant hum of magic. Freya and Atreus stood close by, both watching silently, unsure of what would happen. Then, the circle started to pulse, glowing brighter with every second. Zelos knew this meant the spell had succeeded. He tightened his grip and began to pull, his arm trembling from the resistance. The energy he was drawing felt impossibly heavy, as though he were pulling against the force of an entire realm. After all, the light of Alfheim was one of the anchors that held the realms together. Still, Zelos pulled harder, channeling every ounce of strength he had. The magic circle cracked under the strain, light spilling out in violent bursts, until finally, a blue, ghostly figure emerged from within the light. It was the faint shape of Brock's soul. For a moment, it hovered in front of them, flickering like a dying flame, before being pulled into the abyss mark on Zelos's arm. The mark flared once more, absorbing the soul fragment, then began its secondary process, converting the fragment by separating the light's essence from the soul, returning the spirit to its proper form. Zelos stood quietly as the light subsided. He extended his hand and gathered a small fragment of processed light that still lingered in the air. He divided the fragment into 5 smaller pieces and shared them among his demon summons. Immediately, he felt something shift within their essences. Their presence grew darker yet more defined, each demon resonating with a new energy, the faint trace of primordial power. Zelos could sense their strength rising, which in turn strengthened his own. The sensation sparked an idea. If I can forge a connection with the light itself, he thought, then I can continue to draw from it, just as the elves do. Acting on that thought, he left a small part of his essence embedded within the light. It would serve as a hidden siphon, drawing in energy slowly and naturally over time, enough for him to study and harness. Unlike the elves, however, Zelos intended to purify the energy he drew by filtering out any lost soul fragments, returning them to the river of souls rather than keeping them trapped. Once his task was complete, Zelos finally released the magic circle. The glow around his arm faded until only faint lines remained on his skin. He turned back to Freya and Atreus, who both looked at him with wide eyes. Even with all her centuries of experience, Freya could not understand what she had just witnessed. The runes, the structure of the magic circle, even the way the lightning moved, it was unlike any form of magic she had ever seen. It's done, Zelos said quietly, his tone calm but tinged with satisfaction. All that remains is to return the fragment to Brock. Once I do, the dwarves' secret to moving unseen between realms will be in my hands. He said this softly, making sure his words stayed within the concealment barrier that still surrounded them. Zelos knew Odin's reach extended across all realms, and any carelessness could bring disaster. Freya, unable to contain her curiosity, finally asked, "May I ask what exactly you just did?" "That was unlike any magic I have ever seen." Zelos nodded slightly, deciding to answer truthfully, at least, in part. I have a dwarven friend who lost a piece of his soul, he said. The spell I performed was meant to search through the light of Alfheim and the river of souls to find and retrieve it. It succeeded, thankfully. Once I return it to him, he will teach me the dwarven art of concealment, the one they use to travel between realms without being seen. Freya's expression changed from curiosity to surprise. That kind of magic, and those sigils you used, I have never encountered anything like them. Where did you learn such craft? Zelos's eyes softened. From my mother, he said. Most of what she taught me, I later modified to suit my own needs. Once you understand how the core system of magic works, it's easy to reshape it into different forms. I've read that Vanir magic shares similarities with the Giants' magic, since the Vanir took much of their inspiration from the Jotnar. I know that much, Freya said thoughtfully. But your magic doesn't just resemble theirs, it feels like it is theirs. The control over souls, the way your eyes glow when you cast, even the resonance of your aura, it all reminds me of the Jotnar. Tell me honestly, Zelos, was your mother a giant? The question caught him off guard. Freya had noticed every detail of his casting method, and now that she had voiced her observation, she was nearly certain that Faye carried giant blood, or, at the very least, a deep connection to them. Zelos smiled faintly, neither confirming nor denying. Aren't the Jotnar long-lived, perhaps even immortal? He said calmly. Yet here we are, carrying our mother's ashes to the highest peak in all the realms. That alone should tell you what you already need to know. Freya studied him for a long moment but did not press further. Atreus, listening quietly, had already come to the same conclusion, though he remained silent. Freya eventually looked away, taking Zelos's answer, or his silence, as sufficient. Time passed quietly. The three waited patiently for Kratos to return, but when the minutes stretched on with no sign of movement, Freya grew concerned. You need to pull your father out, she said suddenly, turning to Atreus. I should have mentioned this earlier. The light of Alfheim lures those who have lost someone they love. It traps them with illusions, showing them what they most long to see. Inside, it feels like only a moment passes, but in truth, decades or even centuries can go by. They never realize it until it's too late. Atreus's eyes widened. Without hesitation, he ran toward the light and tried to pull Kratos out. The moment his hands touched the radiance, however, he was burned by its intensity. He cried out in pain and stumbled back, clutching his hands. Zelos! Atreus shouted. Help him! Zelos rushed forward, first casting a quick healing spell on Atreus's burns. Then he stepped toward the light himself. He could feel its heat the moment he reached out. It was unbearable, a burning sensation that crawled into his bones. Yet strangely, he did not scream or falter. Pain was nothing new to him. He remembered the times he had severed his own limbs to grant his demon's physical form. Compared to that, this was almost gentle. He reached deeper into the light until his hands found Kratos's body. Kratos resisted, his voice echoing faintly from within. No. Do not pull me out. Zelos understood what was happening. The light was showing Kratos visions of Faye, tempting him to stay, just as Zelos had once heard his own mother's voice calling to him. But he did not let go. He braced himself and pulled with all his strength. A surge of force burst from the light as Kratos was dragged out, landing roughly on the floor. The Spartan's eyes were wild, his chest heaving as if he had been fighting something unseen. No. What have you done? Kratos roared, his voice filled with anger and confusion. Zelos immediately stepped forward, his tone calm. Forgive me, father, he said. But you have been inside for hours. Freya warned us what would happen. We had to bring you out. Kratos looked at Freya and Atreus, both of whom were watching him with concern. Slowly, his breathing steadied. I thought only a moment had passed, he said, his expression clouded. Freya nodded. That is the illusion the light offers. It traps you in moments of longing, making time meaningless until you forget the world outside. Kratos said nothing. He simply stood still for a while, composing himself. When he finally looked up, his eyes had returned to their familiar steadiness. He picked up the Bifrost device, which now glowed with a brighter light than before. Your bow, boy, Kratos said simply. Atreus handed it to him, and Kratos performed the same ritual Freya had demonstrated earlier to channel the light's power. Freya and Zelos stood nearby, watching quietly. As the energy began to flow, Freya glanced at Zelos from the corner of her eye, as though silently acknowledging something unspoken between them. 3 comments 0 vote. Chapter 39, Back to Midgard. As the objectives in the realm of Alfheim were finally completed, the group of four decided to make their way back to the platform with the sand bowl and return to Midgard. With Atreus' bowstrings now infused with the light of Alfheim, their journey back became noticeably easier. The radiant energy flowing through the bow allowed them to activate light bridges that were previously unusable, granting them access to several shortcuts. Because of this, Zelos did not need to carry them by flight anymore, which was a welcome relief for all of them. I'm a bit disappointed that our time together will be cut short. You're not planning to join us on the rest of our journey, are you? Zelos asked Freya, walking beside her while Kratos and Atreus led ahead. The father and son were having a quiet discussion of their own, and both Zelos and Freya instinctively slowed their pace, sensing the faint tension between the two. We will meet again, I am certain of that. Besides, you and I still have our discussion about magic waiting, do we not? Freya replied, smiling faintly as she reminded Zelos of the promise they had made not too long ago. I'm looking forward to that, Zelos said with a grin that seemed both genuine and tired. Once our mission is over, perhaps we can spend some time together properly. I'd like to understand you more, and maybe learn something that isn't written in any grimoire. Freya chuckled softly at that, her eyes briefly softening. Then I suppose that is something to look forward to. As they continued their walk across the light bridges, they began encountering groups of dark elves marching in formation. They seemed to be parading in victory, which made it clear that the war had reached its end. Many of the light elves were still alive, though their numbers were significantly reduced, and most were captured and bound. Atreus watched the scene with visible discomfort, his hands tightening on his bow, but he chose not to speak. His silence carried more weight than his words could have. Eventually, they reached their boats. Kratos and Atreus boarded one, while Freya and Zelos took the other. As they began to row through the glowing rivers of Alfheim, Freya shared some of her past experiences in the realm, stories of when she last visited, and how the balance between the light and dark had once been more stable. Zelos listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, but mostly allowing her to speak. Meanwhile, in the other boat, Kratos and Atreus had a much heavier exchange. The tension that had been brewing between them finally broke. Atreus had asked if his father had seen his mother within the light, a question that Kratos answered coldly, his tone carrying nothing but restraint. Not that you care anyway, Atreus muttered bitterly, his voice loud enough for both Freya and Zelos to hear across the faint distance. His tone was sharp, filled with resentment and frustration. He truly believed that his father didn't care about anything, that Kratos' silence meant apathy. Mind your tongue, boy. Kratos roared, his patience snapping as he grabbed Atreus by the shoulders. The raw emotion in his voice startled everyone, even Freya, who looked over briefly. Atreus froze, his anger quickly turning into fear. Kratos' grip loosened, and his expression shifted. He took a slow breath, forcing his tone to calm. Until our journey is done, one of us must remain focused. Do not mistake my silence for lack of grief. Mourn in your way, and leave me to mine. The sudden change in Kratos' tone silenced the boy. His father's words pierced through his anger, leaving him with realization instead. I'm sorry, I didn't realize, Atreus said quietly, guilt in his voice. No. Why would you? Kratos replied, his voice steady now. You do not know my ways. This journey has not been easy, and you are not the only one who feels the loss of your mother. But I have a duty to see our mission through. His words lingered in the air, sinking deep into Atreus' heart. Zelos, who had been listening silently, lowered his gaze. He could see the truth that Kratos carried, the weight of years spent suppressing emotion, the heavy grief buried beneath duty. It was a reflection of something Zelos understood far too well. He too had lost something that had changed him slowly, over time, until the person he once was no longer existed. Freya noticed the shift in Zelos' expression and reached out, gently taking his hand. He looked at her, momentarily startled, only to meet her warm and understanding smile. It offered him a small comfort, one that words could not. The rest of the boat ride continued in silence, a calm but heavy quiet that no one wished to disturb. Atreus sat beside his father, contemplative. Kratos kept his eyes forward. Freya enjoyed the serenity of the moment, while Zelos allowed himself to relax, appreciating the stillness before their next trial. After several minutes of rowing, they finally reached the shore near Sindri's workshop. As they stepped out of the boats, Sindri greeted them in his usual wary tone, though his attention quickly turned toward Freya. He noticed something different in her essence, something subtle yet profound. Being attuned to the workings of energy and essence himself, he sensed a quiet transformation within her. Sindri gave her a knowing smile before his eyes shifted briefly toward Zelos, recognizing another layer of power that wasn't there before. The four continued walking until they reached the Bifrost Bridge. Kratos approached the central device without hesitation. The bridge was already open, its structure dormant but ready. He took out the crystal that contained the light of Alfheim and placed it carefully into the slot, just as he had done before. The bridge responded immediately, absorbing the energy that radiated from the light. The mechanism came alive with a low hum, and the runes began to glow as the bridge powered up, its ancient magic weaving itself through the chamber. Kratos turned the wheel to adjust the destination, setting it toward Midgard. As the bridge began to spin, the world around them started to shift once more. Freya and Zelos exchanged a final glance, hers calm and reassuring, his mixed with gratitude and curiosity. Then, as the light faded and the familiar cold air of Midgard returned, the roots that formed the bridge guided them to the exit door. When they stepped through, they found themselves before Brock's workshop. Kratos, Atreus, and Zelos approached the dwarf, while Freya quietly turned away, heading toward her cabin without a word. She did not want to say goodbye, especially since she hoped this parting would not be their last. Brock looked up from his workbench, his expression as full-tempered as ever. "What the fuck do you lot want now?" he said, his gravelly voice echoing across the forge. Zelos couldn't help but let out a small laugh under his breath. They were finally back in Midgard. 40 comments 0 vote. Chapter 40. Completion. "It's done," Zelos said in response to Brock's usual irritated tone. Brock had assumed they were only there to interrupt his work, but the confident look on Zelos' face made him pause. Brock squinted at Zelos suspiciously, then realized what he meant. "Well, what the fuck are you waiting for then? Stick it in me," Brock said bluntly, crossing his arms as if ready for the procedure. Zelos blinked once, then a small smirk tugged on his lips. "Ha ha ha, that's what she said," Zelos muttered, unable to resist. His joke, however, fell completely flat. Brock, Kratos, and Atreus all looked at him blankly, none of them understanding the reference. "Never mind," Zelos said quickly, shaking his head as if to dismiss the awkward silence. He raised his hand, summoning a massive abyssal mark beneath Brock's feet. The black and crimson symbol spread outward, glowing faintly as runes shifted around the dwarf's body. Brock's eyes widened as he felt the pull of the abyss opening beneath him. "Hey, what in the blazes? Relax," Zelos said calmly. "It's part of the process. The mark will complete your soul and stabilize your essence. You'll feel a bit of pressure, but it will not harm you." Brock hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but if this kills me, I'm haunting your ass," he grumbled before letting the abyssal mark engulf him completely. Inside the swirling void of the mark, Brock's body underwent a slow transformation. The fragment of his soul that Zelos had recovered from the light of Alfheim began to merge with his being. The faint blue hue of his skin gradually faded, replaced by his original earthy tone. His aura grew warmer, steadier, more whole than before. It was as if the missing rhythm of his life had returned, filling the hollow space within him. As Zelos watched this transformation, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. The process unfolding before him sparked a new idea, one involving the reconstruction of a soul in its vessel. He had already learned the methods of separation, preservation, and containment, but this was different. This was complete restoration. If I can perfect this, if Mother hadn't died of age, perhaps this could have worked, Zelos thought, the image of Faye flashing briefly in his mind. His eyes glowed faintly as he cast an inner spell, dividing his consciousness. A portion of his mind branched off to begin developing this concept, operating like a second brain working in parallel. It was a technique he had invented long ago, similar to a skill he once called parallel thought. Moments later, the abyssal mark dimmed. Brock rose slowly from its center, stepping out of the shadowed surface with steady feet. The dwarf looked around in confusion, then down at his own arms. His skin no longer shimmered blue, and his vitality felt renewed. He clenched his fists, feeling strength he hadn't known in years. "Welcome back to the living, Brock," Zelos said with a soft grin. He could see the subtle but clear difference, the completion of Brock's soul, the return of a lost spark. Brock flexed his fingers, touching his chest, then exhaled deeply. "Well, I'll be damned. I feel complete," he said, his tone softer than usual. He turned to Zelos and extended his hand in gratitude. "Thank you. Now for my end of the deal." Zelos accepted the handshake, then watched as Brock began to weave a set of intricate runes in the air. The symbols glowed a deep gold, forming a ring that linked to Zelos' body. The energy was different from anything Zelos had seen. It was slower, more methodical, almost like a natural handoff. Brock's technique wasn't as refined as his own instantaneous transfers, but Zelos noticed something fascinating. Brock's magic included a mental buffer that prepared the recipient's mind for the incoming energy, gradually synchronizing it. It was a method of teaching through attunement rather than force. Zelos silently admired it, recording the sequence into his memory. As the magic flowed into him, Zelos felt a sudden shift in perception. His body shimmered faintly, and when it stopped, he was gone from sight. Kratos and Atreus blinked, startled, as if he had vanished into thin air. Zelos, now invisible, reappeared several meters away, grinning at the success. He then teleported briefly to Alfheim, checking on the area near Sindri's old forge, but found it empty. After verifying the stability of the spell, he returned immediately, still invisible, standing right behind Atreus. He dropped the concealment spell without warning. Ah! Atreus screamed, nearly falling forward as Zelos appeared behind him. Zelos laughed heartily while Kratos turned his head with an unamused glare. Neat trick, isn't it? Zelos said proudly. But it has weaknesses. Creatures that can perceive fluctuations in energy, like dragons, can still see through it. That's something I'll need to refine. Brock, who was already hammering away at a set of upgrades for Kratos and Atreus, overheard and grunted. That's because dragons share the same root as dwarves. Some of us can still take draconic forms. We're kin, in a way. Zelos nodded thoughtfully as Brock finished his work. The dwarf tossed the newly forged axe toward Kratos. Kratos caught it mid-air, and immediately, he could feel the difference. The Leviathan axe seemed to hum with power, its balance sharper, its weight lighter. Try it, Brock said proudly. Kratos gave a small nod and hurled the weapon at the nearby wall. The axe spun faster than before, cutting through the air with greater precision. Upon impact, frost spread outward in a thick sheet of ice, stronger and colder than ever. Atreus, holding his bow, felt a similar rush of energy. Brock gestured for him to test it as well. Remembering Zelos' deal with Brock, Atreus pulled back the string, expecting no arrow, and indeed, the bow itself conjured one from pure magic. He aimed at the icy wall, and the arrow transformed into solid ice, releasing with a burst that mirrored Zelos' own frost spell. When he imagined the light of Alfheim, the arrow changed again, drawing from the light infused in his bowstring. A radiant beam formed into an arrow, bright and focused. He released it, and the light shot forward, embedding itself in the ice. Both Kratos and Atreus continued experimenting with their new weapons, visibly pleased. Zelos stood quietly nearby, watching them with satisfaction. His eyes softened slightly. He always found meaning in moments like this, seeing his companions grow stronger. Brock then approached Zelos again, holding something wrapped in cloth. Here, Brock said, pulling it free. A sword gleamed beneath, large and beautiful, radiating heat. This one's for you. Forged with stone from Muspelheim's core and fragments of Surtur himself. The flames it carries can burn through even divine hides. Take it as a gift, my thanks for what you've done. Zelos looked at the weapon, momentarily uncertain. I appreciate it, Brock, but I already have a sword, he said after a pause. And it tends to get jealous when I use others. I might not be able to accept it. Brock scoffed. What could be greater than this? In answer, Zelos unsheathed his own weapon, Voltan. The air around them shifted immediately. The sword pulsed with living lightning, its edge crackling softly. Brock's jaw fell open in disbelief. Sweet Nana's nethers, what in the 9 realms is that? Brock whispered, leaning forward to inspect it. As he reached out, a spark of lightning snapped across the blade, stopping him instantly. The pressure that radiated from it felt like death itself. This is Voltan, Zelos said simply. Born from my own heart and the essence of primordial lightning. It doesn't like being touched, but maybe it'll tolerate this one. He took Brock's gifted sword and held it close to Voltan. For a moment, the two weapons seemed to examine each other. Voltan flared with light, sending faint pulses through the air, then dimmed slightly, almost approvingly. Zelos smiled faintly. It seems it's fine with this weapon, he said, securing Brock's sword at his side. Brock just stood there, shaking his head in awe. To him, the secrets hidden within Zelos were treasures beyond any forge's worth. After some time, Kratos and Atreus finished testing their weapons and returned. They hadn't heard the details of what Zelos and Brock had discussed, but both nodded in quiet respect. Brock crossed his arms, a rare grin on his face. Not bad for a day's work, he muttered. Zelos returned his smile, and the group began preparing to leave once again. As they walked away, Brock watched the back of Zelos with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He didn't know where the boy had come from, but he could tell one thing: Zelos was not ordinary. 54 comments 0 vote. Chapter 41. Inside the Mountain. As they resumed their journey in Midgard, Zelos sensed something unusual. A faint pull in his mind slipped away, and he realized that the magic he had placed on Balder had completely disappeared. The sudden loss made Zelos pause for a moment while the others kept walking. He wondered quietly to himself. Does this mean my spells stop working the moment I leave a realm? Or is it only certain kinds of spells that deal with time or ongoing effects? Maybe the difference in time flow between realms interferes with anything meant to last for a long period. This is something I have never encountered before, and I do not like the idea of having a limitation that I cannot predict yet. While Zelos remained deep in thought, the walk became silent, only the sound of snow crunching under their feet. Atreus suddenly broke the quiet. So what has been going on between you and Freya? Do you think she might become your special someone? Atreus asked. The question came so abruptly that it snapped Zelos out of his internal thinking. He had been trying to analyze the weakness in his magic, and the shift in topics caught him off guard. Whatever happens in my life is none of your concern, Zelos replied. His tone was calm, but it was clear that he did not expect to be questioned like that. Even so, Atreus pushed further, as if he had been holding these questions in for a while. Well, I mean, she is kind of too old for you, right? She is a goddess. She is even older than father and mother. If you do get together, would she not be sad when your life ends while she stays alive? It feels like a very uneven situation. Zelos listened quietly as Atreus spoke. He let him finish before answering, and during that time he thought about his words. I do not really see that as a problem, Zelos said. There are thousands of stories where gods meddle with mortals, and their ages never stop them. Besides, I know magic. There is no telling what I can do once I reach a deeper understanding of everything I want to learn. If I want to match her age, or at least slow my own, there might be ways to do it. I still know only a very small portion of magic. I plan to explore everything that exists until I can do things even the wildest imagination would fail to predict. Atreus became silent, but only for a moment. He then asked a question that made both Kratos and Zelos stop walking at the same time. Do you think you will be able to bring back Mom? Zelos and Kratos looked at Atreus. The boy's expression carried a mixture of hope and fear, and Zelos understood immediately why Atreus asked it. Let me tell you something important, Zelos said slowly. Souls are far more intelligent and far more powerful than people think. They are capable of making their own choices, and if someone forces them, the result will never be what you want. Look at Brock. His body returned because the missing piece of his soul wanted to return. He was fully unaware that he died, and because of that, his soul naturally accepted the restoration. But look at Draugrs. Their souls do not want to be here. They were forced back, and the result is not something anyone would ever consider living. I do not know if this is causation or correlation, but it is not a coincidence. If Mother wants to come back, she could make it happen in her own way. If she does not want to return, then no matter how strong I become, I will not force her. Even if I had all the power in all the realms, would you really want me to drag her away from a peaceful rest just because you miss her? Atreus did not answer. His face lowered, and he walked a little slower. Zelos stayed silent beside him, because halfway through his explanation, he realized he had also been speaking to himself. Kratos eventually spoke as well. Peace and death are not the same, Kratos said. Some think they must be connected, but they are not. Your mother lived her life. She carried her pain, her grief, and her joys. She found peace in her choices. We should not disturb that peace. Kratos walked forward again, though his steps were heavier. Zelos watched his back and knew that the man carried far more than he let show. Kratos had destroyed an entire pantheon, and not every god he killed had deserved their fate. Faye had been the one who taught Kratos how to change. Losing her was not something Zelos could fully understand, even if he knew the entire story from the perspective of a player. Zelos had also lost his mother in both of his lives. Yet his grief came from a human lifespan, not centuries of battles, losses, and regrets. The two kinds of pain could not truly be compared, but they had similarities. What Zelos did understand was that he needed to ensure Kratos and Atreus continued their journey the way Faye intended. Even though he was now part of their adventure, Zelos knew he needed to let them live it as their own story, while he only nudged certain pieces that would not cause a massive change. The group continued walking in silence. All three were thinking about the implications of what Zelos had said earlier. Eventually, they reached the place where their journey had once been halted by a thick wall of black smoke. Atreus and Zelos both looked at Kratos. Kratos took out the device Freya had given him, the one containing the light of Alfheim. Do you think Freya was right? Atreus asked quietly. Zelos answered quickly. A millennia of experience teaches more than anything else. Freya knows what she is talking about. Well, here goes nothing, Atreus said. Kratos raised the device. The light began to activate, its glow spreading outward. It reached toward the black breath and began to push against it. The three stepped forward together as the light pressed further and further, until it grew bright enough to illuminate every corner of the path ahead. Suddenly the light burst outward, clearing the entire black breath at once. The wall of smoke vanished completely, revealing the interior of the mountain at last. Inside, the path upward waited for them, and Kratos and Atreus believed they were now one step closer to their destination. Zelos, however, knew something different awaited them further ahead. 35 comments, 0 vote. Chapter 42, Heart of the Mountain. As the three of them continued exploring the interior of the mountain, they eventually came across a statue of someone who seemed to possess the head of a deer, yet the body was shaped like an ordinary human. The sight of it made Zelos pause for a moment, as he tried to understand what the figure was supposed to represent. Looks like a mink deer to me, Zelos thought, as he inspected the statue in front of him with a curious expression. Atreus and Kratos, meanwhile, walked around the surrounding area while searching for another path forward, since the one in front of them was blocked and too solid to break through without causing unnecessary problems. Father, Zelos, come here. There is another sand bowl and there is a riddle inscribed on the top of it, Atreus called out, raising his voice so they could hear him clearly. Both Zelos and Kratos walked over to where Atreus stood, wanting to see what he was referring to. No yoked beast, nor fearful thrall, nor rooted tree doth know my call, Atreus read aloud once Zelos and Kratos arrived beside him. The riddle hung in the air for a moment as they each considered it. Freedom, Zelos answered as he looked at the bowl, and he then told Atreus to write the rune onto the sand surface. When Atreus completed it, the statue of the deer-like figure began to glow faintly. The staff it held started to gather the light it was emitting, as if it was collecting the energy inside the mountain. After a short moment, the staff released a beam that shot directly toward the wall of enchanted stone ahead. The rocks began to crumble piece by piece, and each layer fell apart as the beam continued emitting its effect. Eventually, the wall broke down entirely, revealing a concealed passage that had been hidden behind it. Kratos moved forward without hesitation, entering the narrow way, with Zelos and Atreus following closely behind him. That rune reminds me of the ones I saw on the giant shrines inside Tyr's temple. Do you think the giants were here before? Atreus asked Kratos while looking around the passage. I do not know. The passages here are far too small for giants, Kratos replied. The moment he said that, Atreus looked at Zelos, and the two of them tried to suppress their amusement. Zelos managed to maintain his composure, but Atreus failed, letting out a louder laugh that Kratos immediately noticed. Why do you laugh? Kratos asked, turning toward Atreus with confusion. Atreus composed himself with some effort, glancing at Zelos to help explain. Father, giants are usually meant to refer to the race, not their height. That is why they should be called Jotun. They probably got called giants because there are many among them who are large enough to deserve that title, but not every Jotun is like that, Zelos explained. Kratos nodded once as he accepted the clarification, and the three of them continued walking along the path. The hidden passage led deeper toward the heart of the mountain, and as they advanced, they began to encounter more monsters and enemies. These creatures were dispatched quickly, with each of them testing their weapons and skills along the way. Zelos was especially eager to try his new weapon, which cut through an ice draugr instantly due to its sharpness, weight, and perfect balance. I would enjoy using this more often, Zelos commented as he examined the sword in his hands. Atreus also tried out the upgrades to his bow and quiver, while Kratos used the chance to adjust his own approach, letting them test themselves as they moved forward. After a long period of trekking and defeating enemies, they reached an open space with a large platform situated in the center. Kratos noticed that this platform was connected to a lever system that appeared to be intended to lift them upward. However, he also saw that the platform would not work properly without additional leverage. The three of them jumped down toward the lower area where the platform rested, and the moment they landed, countless draugrs began to rise. They emerged from every corner, as if they had been waiting to be disturbed. More monsters started to spawn randomly throughout the room, surrounding Kratos, Zelos, and Atreus from every direction. Realizing the situation they were in, all three prepared their weapons. Zelos decided to use a spell that he had been wanting to test for a long time, but had not yet found the right moment to do so. Blessing, Sacred Turn Undead, Zelos cast, placing his hand along the blade of his newly obtained sword. A white flame ignited along the metal, replacing the usual orange color of ordinary fire. With that, Zelos charged forward and began cutting through the Draugrs. Kratos ran beside him, while Atreus provided continuous support from behind with precise arrows. Zelos swung his sword into one of the Draugrs, and the creature disintegrated immediately upon contact. This made Zelos smile slightly before stepping into his next motion. He deflected an incoming strike, spun to kick a Draugr attempting to ambush him, and moved from one enemy to another without allowing any of their weapons to touch him. He tapped deeply into his training with Kratos, controlling every part of his movement, from the strength behind each swing to the precision at the very tip of the blade. Nothing was wasted. Every attack, block, and step connected into the next, forming a smooth flow of continuous motion. More than 30 minutes passed as the three of them fought together. During this time, Kratos instructed Atreus on how to conserve stamina and use precision instead of strength when fighting groups of enemies. Atreus's skill with the bow noticeably improved, and he applied his training with fewer mistakes each time he released an arrow. When the last enemy fell and the fighting stopped, the three of them stepped onto the platform. Zelos lifted it by directing his strength upward, and he then cut the lever that had been holding it in place, ensuring there would be no interference as they rose. Father, what happens after we scatter Mother's ashes? Atreus asked suddenly, thinking their journey was coming to an end. For now, that is all. But you were correct when you said the forest changed. We must prepare for whatever dangers might come in the future, Kratos answered in his deep voice. What do you think, Zelos? Atreus asked, noticing that Zelos seemed distracted by something. I think I smell blood, Zelos replied, which made both Atreus and Kratos look at him with confusion. Before either of them could ask him more, a focused bolt of lightning struck the platform. Zelos reacted immediately and created a barrier that protected them from the impact. A loud screech echoed from above, revealing the attacker. A dragon emerged from the open area of the mountain, circling them with hostility. It attacked again, but the barrier still held, forcing the dragon to fly upward, away toward the open space, while Zelos, Atreus, and Kratos continued rising on the platform, listening to the distant cries of the creature. 39 comments 0 vote. Chapter 43. Dragon. As the three finally landed on the ledge that led out of the mountain's interior, they began hearing the loud roars of the same dragon that had attacked them earlier. The sound echoed around the stone walls, and mixed into the noise was a familiar voice that carried a very distinct panic. Ah! Get away! Get away! The voice that followed was undeniably Sindri's, high-pitched and trembling, which immediately made Atreus panic. Before he could even think properly, he started to run toward the exit of the cave, driven only by the fear of losing their friend. Atreus, Kratos said as he grabbed Atreus by the arm, stopping him before he could throw himself directly into danger. Atreus struggled for a brief moment, but Kratos held him firmly, while Zelos stood to the side and looked outward with a more focused expression, already thinking about how much he could salvage from the dragon once they were done. It is Sindri, we have to help him, Atreus insisted. His tone was desperate, as if thinking that Sindri would not survive another second. He looked between the two of them, hoping someone would agree and move. Kratos finally nodded. Find a safe distance to take your attacks. Zelos, with me, he ordered, and the three began sprinting through the last stretch of the cave. The sunlight at the end grew brighter as they approached, revealing the open side of the mountain. When they stepped out, they saw the huge form of the dragon lowering its claws toward a small figure on the ground. Sindri's blue tunic made it very obvious that it was him. Zoltrak, Zelos said as he immediately fired his spell toward the dragon's claw. The strike forced the creature to pull its hand back, while Atreus raced forward and fired several arrows toward the exposed scales around its belly. The arrows bounced off harmlessly, and all they managed to do was irritate the creature even further. The dragon reared its head and prepared to release a lightning breath. Zelos sensed the charge building inside its throat, so he summoned a large boulder in front of him and hurled it straight into the dragon's open mouth. Right after the boulder flew, Kratos threw his axe, and the axe encased the boulder in ice. The moment the dragon attempted to release the lightning, the breath collided with the frozen rock and triggered a violent internal explosion. The dragon's head jerked backward, and its entire body shook as it fell limp for a moment. It was not defeated, but it was stunned. Atreus quickly pulled Sindri to safety behind a cluster of rocks. Zelos raised a large barrier over them to protect them from any stray attacks. Kratos and Zelos remained ahead, watching as the dragon struggled back to its feet. While the dragon recovered, Zelos began chanting a spell he had been wanting to test. Several copies of himself appeared in flickers of light, each taking a position around the dragon. They moved in a formation that encircled the entire beast, and every copy summoned chains made from the crimson bands of Cytoric. The chains hooked onto the dragon's limbs, wings, and neck, and all the clones worked together to yank the dragon downward. The creature struggled, thrashing violently as the bands dug into its scales, but the collective force of the clones overpowered it and held it still. Kratos saw that Zelos had already taken control of the battle and realized his strength was not needed. With nothing left to do, he walked over to Sindri and Atreus, watching silently as Zelos prepared another spell. Zelos raised his hand and summoned a large spear of light, which spun rapidly until it resembled a drill. He flew upward and aimed the drill at the dragon's closed mouth. The chains prevented the creature from opening it, and the moment the spinning spear pierced the scales around its jaw, the dragon let out a muffled cry. Zelos continued by summoning more spears of the same light, and they began raining down upon the creature's body. Each impact stuck into the dragon as if pinning it to the very ground beneath it. Sindri and Atreus watched in silence. Even though both disliked dragons, the sight slowly shifted into something that made them uncomfortable. The sheer number of spears made it clear that Zelos was not holding back even a little. The dragon's body was covered with dozens upon dozens of glowing punctures. Finally, Zelos summoned a large light sword. With one clean slash, he severed the dragon's head, ending the fight. Its body went still, and the mountain fell quiet again as Zelos floated downward. He landed at the same moment the dragon's severed head dropped beside him, almost in perfect timing. Without waiting, Zelos summoned an abyss star. This time the spell's formation included the same alchemy symbols he had used to create his 5 demons. He knew exactly what he wanted. The head and various parts of the dragon's body were pulled into the magic circle, where they slowly changed shape. The flesh and bone twisted and solidified into a pair of wings and a pair of eyes with draconic features. The whole process glowed with intense energy. Atreus, Sindri, and Kratos approached him carefully. Zelos continued chanting until the items looked complete. To finish the process, he slit his wrist and let his blood flow over the wings and eyes. The items absorbed his blood and began burning with a bright light. When the glow faded, Zelos lifted them with both hands. 2 fully formed essence items rested in his palms, wings of a dragon god and eyes of a dragon god. He let out a small breath of satisfaction before turning to the group. That was quite the battle, Sindri said awkwardly, still unsure how to process what he had just witnessed. Kratos stepped forward and gave a rare comment. Good. But if you can end a fight early, end it. Leave no room for mistakes, Kratos said. It was a compliment, and both Zelos and Atreus knew how uncommon such praise was. They could count the number of times he had given compliments on 2 fingers. Atreus pointed at the items. What are those? Zelos smiled slightly. Essence items. One is a set of wings that will allow whoever receives them to summon the wings whenever they want and use them for flight. The other is a pair of eyes, enhanced with my magic so the user can see the world as I do. The 3 reacted with surprise. Kratos recovered first. Atreus, however, immediately set his interest on the wings. I want the wings. If you are willing to give them, Atreus said. Zelos turned the wings into light, and the light merged gently into Atreus' back. Atreus felt the energy settle behind his shoulders. Zelos then looked at Kratos and offered him the eyes. Kratos hesitated but eventually accepted. When the merging finished, Kratos opened his eyes and saw the world in a way that was far more detailed than anything he had known. From where he stood, he could see their home as if it were only a short distance away. He saw the subtle movement of the forest, tiny shifts that he normally missed. He also saw the light that he and Atreus emitted, the same kind that Zelos had described before. Their divine presence was visible as faint layers of color. He looked at Zelos and noticed that Zelos' presence not only glowed brightly but also flickered between different colors, shifting almost constantly. The only other presence that acted like this was Atreus, whose aura shifted between bright gold and blue. Kratos did not understand what the colors meant, and he did not want to think too deeply about it. He closed the eyes of power, switching back to his normal sight. Meanwhile, Atreus was already floating above the ground. He flapped the newly obtained wings with excitement, lifting himself higher into the air while he tried to maintain balance. Chapter 44. Mistletoe. As soon as Zelos finished crafting the items he had been working on, Sindri, who was observing him from the side, found himself unable to hide the amazement growing in his expression. Sindri had seen many crafts in his lifetime, and he had performed even more, yet the sight of Zelos shaping materials without laying a single finger on them made him almost forget how long he had lived. When he noticed that the essence of the finished items remained untouched and completely preserved, Sindri walked toward Zelos immediately after Zelos finished handing his gifts to both Kratos and Atreus. What kind of magic is that? I have never witnessed anything even remotely similar to it, and it may be one of the most remarkable sights these tired old eyes have ever seen, Sindri said, staring directly at Zelos with genuine awe. Zelos looked back calmly. You truly have a sharp eye for such things, but unfortunately, this is not something I would lightly share with anyone. Not even Father or Atreus knows the exact method behind this magic, Zelos answered. Sindri did not seem offended or disappointed. Oh, I would not dare ask for something so rare. Being able to watch it even once is already something I will cherish for a very long time. When you live for as long as I have, you realize that there is almost nothing left in the world that can surprise you. Yet here I am, feeling like a young craftsman again, Sindri said, before he began searching through his purse. The purse looked small, no larger than a simple rectangular pouch that could fit inside the palm of a hand. However, the depth of the space inside and the items Sindri pulled from it did not match its outside appearance. It used the same spatial principle as the cube that Zelos relied on to store his belongings, a technique that compressed objects until they were called forth by Zelos' magic. After searching for a long moment, Sindri pulled out a set of green-colored arrows. Zelos, who already knew what role these arrows would play in the future, did not react with any surprise. This is for letting me see that marvelous display and for saving my life earlier. These are braided missile arrows. They fly straighter than anything else, straight enough that even Heimdall would struggle against them, Sindri said as he handed them to Zelos. Zelos took them without hesitation. Thank you, but I think you might be giving them to the wrong person. I do not use a bow, Zelos replied. Sindri blinked and then realized his mistake. He took the arrows back from Zelos and handed them toward Atreus, who had just landed after testing the wings he received earlier. Thank you. Brock already worked on my bow so it does not really need arrows anymore, but thanks anyway, Atreus said. His tone unintentionally offended Sindri, who began rambling about how Brock's methods were outdated, and how Brock's craftsmanship lacked certain refinements that Sindri believed only he could provide. The rambling eventually led Sindri to pull out a tooth from his pocket, one that resembled the teeth of the dragon Zelos had recently fought. Sindri immediately began enchanting it. When he finished, he brushed the enchanted tooth across the string of Atreus's bow. Zelos knew that a single stroke was normally enough for this kind of enhancement, but Sindri brushed it more than 10 times with visible irritation. When Sindri stepped back, Atreus pulled the bowstring to test it. A dense surge of lightning gathered far faster than before, and Atreus pulled it to its limit before firing. The arrow of energy traveled in a straight line and struck a cluster of red crystals that were known to explode upon blunt contact. The impact caused a large explosion that was further amplified by Sindri's enhancement. The blast was powerful enough that it nearly matched the force Zelos produced when casting a basic fireball spell, although the explosion had a noticeably larger area of effect. Kratos, who still kept his eyes active in sensing magic, saw the way the energy gathered on Atreus's bow and glanced at Zelos. Zelos was observing the explosion with the same attentive look. Awesome, Atreus muttered, unable to say anything else. Sindri proudly explained every part of the upgrade he applied to the bow, pleased that the result exceeded what he intended. The three resumed their journey afterward, leaving Sindri behind to clean up the debris that Atreus had accidentally created. As Kratos walked beside Zelos, he initiated a conversation. Is this truly how you see the world? Through colors and patterns that reflect its nature? Kratos asked. Zelos was visibly surprised that Kratos would take interest in such details. Yes, and there is something you should know. If you look closely at Atreus, you will see a black substance gathering around him. It forms because of his uncertainty and his lack of knowledge about who he is. He may seem fine for now, but when that darkness becomes large and visible enough that you no longer need to search for it, it will not be good for him, Zelos explained. Kratos looked at Atreus again and, for the first time, saw the faint essence Zelos described. It was something he had no way of noticing before. The sight caused Kratos to feel a quiet but heavy worry. Can you remove it? Kratos asked. Zelos shook his head. No. I can stop it from spreading, but only you can remove it entirely, Zelos answered. Kratos fell silent as Atreus continued ahead of them, adjusting and fixing his quiver strap. Seeing this, Kratos quickened his pace and reached Atreus. He placed a hand on his shoulder and then used one of Atreus's arrows to secure the quiver strap back into place. Pain we endure. Faulty weapon we do not, Kratos said, offering simple but firm guidance. Atreus nodded. Zelos watched them quietly from behind and let out a small sigh, realizing he once again failed to persuade Kratos to tell Atreus the truth. He understood that Kratos would eventually seek Freya because of this. The three continued onward through the mountain until they reached an area that required them to climb. Atreus began to slowly ascend using his wings, while Kratos reminded him to slow down and pace himself, and Zelos floated beside them at a steady speed. 39 comments 0 vote. Chapter 45. The Smartest Man Alive. As the three of them began climbing toward the summit of the mountain, Kratos did not permit Zelos to fly directly upward, even though Zelos could have reached the top with little effort. Kratos had seen something faint and distant that only he and Zelos seemed capable of perceiving, and because of this, he did not want Zelos to move too far ahead or attract attention. Zelos, who was floating slightly above the ground while they walked, began noticing the unusual magic gathering near the summit. There was a presence that shone like the sun, so bright that it was almost blinding, even to him. Along with that brightness, there were two other presences that felt unstable, like a storm that was slowly building up and preparing to release its strength at any moment. As they got closer, the three of them started hearing the faint sound of voices echoing from the very top of the mountain. Zelos reacted immediately and cast a concealment barrier around them, along with a protection barrier layered on top of it. The concealment made them silent, invisible, and even undetectable, while the protection would lessen the risk if something reached down from the summit. Do you two hear those voices? Atreus asked, lowering his voice even though he was unsure if it mattered. Quiet boy, Kratos answered with a serious tone. Do not worry. We are inside my concealment spell. Even if you shouted at the top of your lungs, none of them would be able to hear anything, Zelos said. Atreus, curious and wanting to test it, raised his voice and shouted loudly. The spell held, but Kratos was angered by the unnecessary risk. Boy, Kratos said sharply, with a glare that made Atreus end his testing immediately, although Kratos did not scold him further. As they climbed closer, the voices became more audible. You know why we are here. My last visit managed to loosen your tongue, said a voice that Kratos immediately recognized. The tone, the way of speaking, and the manner of the words all matched Baldur, the same man they had fought and defeated earlier. Kratos turned his head toward Zelos, who floated quietly beside him. That sounds exactly like the man who came to our house. I thought you handled him already. Atreus whispered. That is what I thought as well, Zelos answered in a low voice. Kratos made both of them stop speaking so he could focus on the conversation happening above them. I see you brought company this time. It must be important if the sons of Thor are willing to show their faces. Tell me, are you two still tripping over yourselves trying to impress your father? Another voice said, and Zelos recognized it immediately as Mimir. That confirmed that the two other presences watching the summit were Magni and Modi, the sons of Thor. An old friend, Zelos thought, remembering how long it had been since he last talked with Mimir. He had been too busy during their previous journey to speak to him. The tattooed man. Tracks show he now travels with another child, not just the magic caster. Where would they go next? Baldur asked Mimir. And why would I know that? Mimir questioned, clearly annoyed. You are the smartest man alive, aren't you? Magni said to Mimir. Smarter than all the dead ones too, Mimir replied in a dry and sarcastic tone. You help me, and I will help you. Tell me where they are, and I will talk to Odin about your situation, Baldur said, trying to strike a bargain. Mimir cut him off before he could finish. Your father will not release me, Baldur, and he will not let you kill me. You have absolutely nothing to offer. So take your threats, take your questions, take these two worthless wankers, and go away. Mimir insulted all three of them without hesitation, knowing that none of them could harm him without Odin himself allowing it. When no one is looking, we will come back for your other eye, Modi said, making a threat that sounded more childish than intimidating. Balder looked disappointed with the two brothers and insulted them for their lack of usefulness as the three of them began preparing to leave. Zelos floated upward to scout them, watching as all three disappeared from sight through a summoning of crows. Zelos recognized that magic instantly. It belonged to Odin. Because of this, he resummoned several eagles and sent them flying outward, targeting the ravens that were observing the summit. He then cast a large barrier across the entire area, which served as an anti-detection spell, hiding the summit from Odin's ravens and other forms of surveillance. Kratos finally reached the top, with Zelos and Atreus landing near him once he was safely on the summit. Mimir, still bound and unable to move, sensed something strange but could not understand what had changed in the environment. Zelos had improved his concealment magic to such an extent that even someone with Mimir's eyes, knowledge, and awareness could not detect it. Zelos then released the concealment spell, allowing them to be seen once more. Mimir looked surprised as he noticed the eagles circling around, creatures he had not seen for several days. Ah, the very topic of conversation. The tattooed man traveling with a sorcerer child and another child, Mimir said, nodding toward them. Kratos turned toward Atreus, who stood silently beside him. Boy, check their trail and be certain we are alone, Kratos ordered. Atreus tried to argue, but Kratos raised his voice, leaving him no choice but to obey. Zelos remained beside his father, watching quietly. He does not know what you are, Mimir said to Kratos, already understanding the unspoken tension between Kratos and Atreus, while giving Zelos a knowing look. And I would keep it that way. Who are you? Kratos asked. Mimir cleared his throat, preparing the same introduction he had always used. Zelos rolled his eyes slightly, recognizing the familiar routine. Me. I am the greatest ambassador to the gods, the giants, and every creature in the 9 realms. I know every corner of these lands, every language ever spoken, every war ever fought, and every deal ever made. They call me Mimir, the smartest man alive, and I have the answer to your every question. Mimir announced proudly. Before Kratos could reply, Zelos spoke first. You still have not changed, Mimir, Zelos said. Mimir turned toward him and smiled. Ah, my friend, it has been far too long. I must say, your true form being a child was not something I expected. It surprised me quite a bit, Mimir replied warmly. He knew Zelos was the one he had communicated with through the eagle form, and realizing that the child standing before him was that same presence amused him greatly. Kratos looked between the two of them, confused, as Zelos and Mimir spoke with each other in a way that only old acquaintances would. Chapter 46. Free. I never expected you to look this young. Usually, anyone who can master magic at the level you display is already thousands of years old. Magic requires constant refinement and long periods of trial and error. Yet here you are, barely entering adulthood but already standing among the strongest magic users I have ever seen, Mimir said to Zelos, still watching him with curiosity as if trying to fit every piece together. Ha 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 ha, that mouth of yours will eventually cause trouble for you. Many would take those words as nothing but empty praise. Not me, though. I appreciate compliments when they are genuine, Zelos replied, and the two of them shared a laugh that felt a bit too natural considering the situation. Kratos then walked toward them, and both Zelos and Mimir slowly turned their attention to him once they realized they had been talking as if he was not even there. Forgive the rudeness. It has been a long time since I spoke with my friend here. I did not expect the child you travel with to be a god, although I suspected something. No creature across all 9 realms can control magic on such a massive scale as easily as he can. You must be proud, brother, Mimir said to Kratos, who then looked at Zelos with a stern expression. Explain, Kratos said, clearly bothered that things had been happening without his knowledge. Zelos calmly nodded. Do you remember when I told you that I constantly summon multiple eagles and owls to search every part of Midgard, since new angles help me understand magic better? Mimir was the only one who could detect me. It caught my interest, and I started talking with him. He was not exaggerating when he said he was the smartest man alive. He helped me refine one of the most complex spells I have ever attempted. In exchange, I have been searching for a method to free him from these bindings he is trapped in. Mimir smiled at that memory while Zelos continued explaining, both of them briefly falling silent as they recalled the long process of experimenting and exchanging ideas. After a few more moments, Atreus finally returned, looking somewhat tired but attentive. No one out there. I told you already, Atreus said while catching his breath. Kratos did not respond, instead turning toward Mimir, who looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he already expected to be asked questions. Their mother is dead. She wanted us to, Kratos began, but Atreus finished it for him. She wanted us to spread her ashes on the highest peak of all the realms, Atreus explained. Mimir's expression shifted into something softer, almost sympathetic. Oh. Then you came to the wrong place, little brother. The highest peak is not here in Midgard. It is in Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, Mimir said. Kratos and Atreus both stiffened with frustration. That is not what she meant, Kratos said, trying to deny it, but Mimir pressed the point. Take a look. This is the last known bridge to Jotunheim. That mountain over there, the one shaped like a giant's fingertip scraping the sky, that is the real highest peak of all the realms. Not this one. Mimir showed them the mountain through an illusion. Why can't we use that bridge? We have the Bifrost, Atreus asked. When the giants destroyed the other bridges, they locked this one away with a secret rune. If the rune still exists, only a giant would know it, Zelos said as he stepped in, making it clear he already understood the situation. But the giants left Midgard long ago, Atreus replied. True. Yet today, fate has stirred up something unusual. Only two living beings can get you where you need to go. Fortunately for you, my schedule is empty, Mimir replied, making both Kratos and Atreus feel even more confused. 2. Who is the second one? Atreus asked. Zelos answered immediately. Me. Mimir is referring to me. I am one of the few who can speak the obscure tongue, Zelos said. Obscure tongue. Wait, do you mean? Atreus began. Yes. I can speak with the world serpent, Zelos replied. Atreus looked shocked, while Kratos only seemed mildly surprised but clearly thinking through the implications. Why did you not speak to him earlier? And why did you not tell us? Atreus asked. First, I had no reason to speak with him. Should I disturb him just because I can? Second, I did say something earlier that should have made it obvious. I said that since neither of you speak the obscure tongue, you could not understand him even if he spoke. I assumed that was enough, but apparently not, Zelos said. Kratos then asked, what do we need to do, Zelos? Zelos looked at Mimir, then back to Kratos. Can we bring Mimir with us? Having someone knowledgeable is better than guessing our way through everything. Kratos studied Mimir for a moment before finally answering. Fine. What must be done? Zelos nodded in satisfaction while Atreus and Mimir both reacted with excitement. Atreus immediately began asking Mimir questions, while Kratos stood in silence, still processing everything. I will handle it. Mimir, are you ready for your freedom? Zelos asked. Mimir froze, eyes widening with disbelief. You mean you discovered it? Mimir said, barely able to keep his voice steady. Zelos nodded, and Mimir nearly jumped in joy, though Kratos and Atreus were once again confused. What is going on? Atreus asked. Mimir is bound here by Odin. No weapon, not even Thor's hammer, can free him. When I met your brother, he began developing an anti-binding spell. It seems he finally finished it, Mimir explained. Atreus looked at Zelos. You two know each other. I will explain later. For now, I will free him, Zelos said. He then raised his hand and summoned complex circles of magic around the tree. The circles glowed before breaking apart into countless small butterflies, each one landing upon the runes carved into the wood. Every butterfly absorbed a portion of the magic that held the bindings in place. The more butterflies that appeared, the more the magic weakened, and cracks began forming on the surface of the tree. Zelos was analyzing everything as it happened, every fragment of absorbed magic processed and stored in his mind. The wood eventually split apart entirely as the final runes collapsed. In the next moment, Mimir fell forward, freed from a curse that had bound him for so long. His form was exposed, and Zelos immediately conjured clothing for him. Mimir stood in disbelief, touching his chest and arms as if still expecting the restraints to remain. For the first time since the three arrived at the summit, Mimir was completely free, alive, and able to stand on his own. 44 comments 0 vote. Chapter 47. Mimir's Magic. Thank you, little brother. I truly did not imagine that one conversation would eventually lead to my freedom. Fate has a very unusual way of connecting people, Mimir said, still sounding pleasantly shocked. Before he could say more, Kratos stepped in front of him, casting a shadow that made Mimir stand straighter. Why does the son of Odin hunt us? Kratos asked. It was the question he had been trying to ask earlier, but the events that followed Zelos freeing Mimir had kept pushing the topic aside. Mimir hummed as he thought. There are gaps in my knowledge, brother, yet I am not without wit. If you give me time, I can piece things together. Kratos nodded, accepting that answer for now. Congratulations on your freedom. It must feel nice to finally move again, Atreus said suddenly as he approached Mimir. It does feel nice, lad. And an act like freeing me is not something I can allow to go unrewarded, Mimir replied. He then turned toward Zelos, who had been quietly observing from the side. You do not have to repay anything. Your advice was already enough. It helped me solve a spell I never thought I would complete, Zelos said. His tone made it clear that he meant every word. Nonsense. My advice costs nothing, especially for a friend. But this act is beyond advice, and I refuse to leave it unpaid. Tell me what you desire, and I will do what I can to give it, Mimir said. Zelos hesitated. He did not want Mimir to feel indebted, but the look on Mimir's face made it obvious nothing would change his mind. Fine, if you insist. Teach me any magic you can teach, Zelos said without thinking too deeply about the phrasing. In his mind, Mimir would teach him a single spell or technique. However, Mimir, who had once been known as Puck and was born of the Fae, took words in their most literal form. So when the opportunity to give more presented itself, he did not hesitate. Very well. I will teach you any magic that I can teach. That is our agreement, Mimir said. As he spoke, an illusion formed around him and slowly expanded until it resembled an entire library, one clearly connected to Mimir's mind rather than any physical structure. What is this, Mimir? Zelos asked. He had not expected anything on this scale. I am simply honoring the deal. You asked me to teach you any magic I can teach, and I am capable of teaching everything contained in my mind. This is one of the spells. I can transfer it directly into your head, Mimir replied. Atreus and Kratos stood to the side silently, unsure whether to intervene or remain quiet. Their silence only added to the tension. No, that is not what I meant. One spell would have been enough, Zelos said quickly. Mimir shook his head. I am sorry, little brother, but I always follow the exact wording of a deal, Mimir said. Before Zelos could stop him, a concentrated beam of light connected Mimir's mind to Zelos. Information began to pour into Zelos at a speed that made it difficult for him to even identify individual strands of knowledge. The transfer was not chaotic, however. Every spell, ritual, and theoretical concept arrived in a perfectly organized manner. Mimir had collected knowledge throughout several lifetimes. Most of it was built from nature magic and illusion magic, which had been taught to him by his old master long before he met Odin. There were also pieces of knowledge taken from various races that lived within the Yggdrasil, along with some spells he learned during his service to Odin. Hundreds of thousands of spells and rituals flooded into Zelos' mind. Each one came with the detailed reasoning behind its creation, its possible uses, countermeasures, weaknesses, and the conditions required for mastering it. Although the transfer lasted 10 minutes, Zelos experienced it as if he had been in a dreamlike state for much longer. When the light finally faded, his head felt painfully heavy with new information. Yet beyond the pain, there was clarity. In the span of a few minutes, he had become a master of illusion magic, nature magic, and even portions of arcane magic. This is too much, Mimir. Truly. It is far more than I expected, Zelos said as he placed a hand to his forehead. Mimir simply shook his head. When I was imprisoned, none of the magic I had collected could free me. All my knowledge became useless at the moment I needed it most. It was a harsh lesson, and if given the choice, I would still gather that knowledge again. You gave me freedom. Passing on my knowledge is the least I can do. Zelos stayed quiet, unable to argue. Mimir's sincerity left nothing to contest. All right then. I will accept it. These spells do not exist in this realm and cannot be learned through regular study. It would be foolish to reject something that cannot be gained again, Zelos said. Atreus blinked. Wait. Why do you have magic that is not from this realm? Oh, I am not originally from here, lad. I come from a faraway land with a name I no longer use. When I arrived on these shores, I chose to live as a different man. But that is a story for another time, Mimir said. Atreus accepted the answer easily enough, while Kratos watched Mimir with faint understanding. Kratos, too, had left behind a homeland, and Mimir's words raised questions Kratos did not voice. Enough. We must continue our journey. Where do we go next, Mimir? Kratos asked after a moment of silence. We will go to the location of the last giant who remains in Midgard. Near there, you will find a platform with a horn. Blow it to summon the world serpent, Mimir explained. The four of them then walked toward the cliff. Zelos cast a flying spell on Kratos so they could all descend at the same pace. Zelos was already capable of floating on his own, while Atreus and Mimir summoned wings on their backs. The four of them stepped off the cliff and slowly descended toward the forest, making sure not to waste time on the long path down. 34 comments 0 vote. Chapter 48. Conversations with the World Serpent. The four of them quickly made their way down to the area where Zelos had previously killed the dragon. Together, they retraced their steps along the mountain path. During the descent, Atreus walked beside Mimir and continued asking him questions without pause. Would the World Serpent really talk to us? What if he gets angry that we disturbed him? Atreus asked while Mimir listened with a patient expression. Not quite, little laddie. Few realize this, but Jormungandr enjoys conversation. The problem is that he speaks a dead tongue older than these mountains themselves. Hardly anyone alive knows how to understand it. Only me and Zelos can speak it fluently, Mimir answered. Atreus suddenly looked thoughtful as an idea formed in his mind. Do you think you could teach me how to speak to the World Serpent? The same way you taught Zelos? Atreus asked, clearly interested in the idea of learning another ancient language. You might not even need formal instruction. Once you hear Mimir speak, you might pick it up faster than either of us expects. You are far more talented than me when it comes to languages, Zelos said. He knew perfectly well that Atreus had a natural gift for understanding words and symbols. Odin had relied on that same ability during the search for the mask. You really think so? Atreus asked, turning toward Zelos with a hopeful look. Zelos simply nodded. Mimir watched the exchange with interest. If that is the case, then you may also have a strong talent for magic. True sorcery begins with understanding the foundation of language. Those who master the roots of words often grow into exceptional spellcasters, Mimir said, and Atreus's eyes lit up with excitement. Thank you, Mimir, Atreus replied, which made Mimir look slightly embarrassed at being complimented so directly. They continued along the path and soon encountered more draugrs blocking their way. Kratos broke through the front line while Zelos silently eliminated several with precise spells. Atreus joined the fight, and Mimir demonstrated some of his abilities as well. Thick branches burst from the ground and wrapped around several draugrs, crushing them slowly. When one draugr managed to swing at him, Mimir appeared to be struck in the neck, only for the image to flicker and vanish. The real Mimir reappeared at the creature's side and drove a blade straight into its skull. Atreus stared with amazement. That was an impressive spell. Could you teach me that one? Of course, little laddie. Would you like me to transfer the knowledge directly into your mind? Mimir asked, offering the same method he had once used for Zelos. Atreus immediately shook his head. No, I prefer learning things the usual way. Zelos told me that if I rely on shortcuts too much, I will never absorb spells into my subconscious the same way as when I learn them properly, Atreus said. Experience is important when learning magic. It is what separates someone who simply knows a spell from someone who has mastered it, Mimir added. Atreus looked at Mimir again. Then why did you directly insert information into Zelos's mind? Mimir chuckled. Because your brother is extremely stubborn. If I tried to teach him every spell step by step, he would have stopped after the second lesson once he realized the amount of explanation involved. He is clever and already has a massive foundation of magic. He had the experience to handle the direct method. Atreus nodded and looked toward Zelos, who simply listened quietly while Kratos continued leading the group forward without giving any comment on the topic. After a long period of walking and retracing their route, they finally arrived at the bridge. Mimir then began guiding them toward the horn embedded into the old structure. Once they reached it, Mimir prepared himself. All right, wish me luck, he said as he blew the horn. The sound echoed across the entire lake. Even the calm surface of the water trembled with small ripples. Far in the distance, the enormous serpentine body shifted, stretching across the mountain range. The world serpent slowly lifted his head, rising high enough for the four to see his massive eyes. Without warning, Jormungandr suddenly attacked the statue of Thor sitting in the lake. He crushed the stone figure and chewed it in large chunks before swallowing it whole. Why is he doing that? Does it not hurt him? Atreus asked as he watched the scene unfold. To answer your first question, Odin built that statue to honor Thor. The world serpent despises him, so he was most likely tired of staring at it. And for the second question, well, he and Thor share an unpleasant history. Or they will share one. Waking up to see the statue must have irritated him more than swallowing chunks of stone, Mimir explained. He saw Atreus preparing to ask more, but Kratos interrupted. No. Our only concern is Jotunheim, Kratos said firmly. Zelos then leaned closer to Atreus. Watch the exchange carefully. Even if you cannot understand the words yet, try to observe how they speak. Mimir began speaking to the world serpent in the ancient tongue. At first, Jormungandr appeared angry, rising higher as though preparing to attack. Mimir quickly clarified the misunderstanding. He knows the pain of your loss. He will assist us, Mimir stated, and the world serpent lowered his head. He then nudged the bridge to shift its position toward their intended destination. Before moving fully, Jormungandr's attention shifted toward Atreus and Zelos. The serpent uttered a long series of deep sounds that only Zelos and Mimir could understand. I know these too, the world serpent said. The statement surprised Mimir. Interesting, Mimir commented quietly as the bridge continued to move. Atreus, curious and impatient, asked, "What did he say, Mimir? Did he mention something important?" "Oh, nothing for you to worry about," Mimir replied, though Atreus clearly did not believe him and turned toward Zelos. "He said he knows us. If I had to guess, he encountered us in the future. There is an old story Mimir told me once. During Ragnarok, Thor and the world serpent fought so violently that the force of it shook the entire Yggdrasil tree. The world serpent was thrown through the fabric of time and sent backward into the past. It is just a story, so take it lightly, but it aligns with what he said," Zelos explained. Atreus listened carefully while Mimir continued speaking quietly with Kratos about what their next steps should be. To be continued. Thanks for watching.